what was being said. Normally in a committee process in the legislature, if it's a standard standing committee, actually there's an announcement ahead of time that says, no displays of either support or of disapproval. And although I don't know, I certainly love to get instantaneous feedback myself. I do think that as we go through, we'll end up having some people that probably you would rather not applaud for and would be potentially more inclined to boo for. Just saying, that's how the American process works. So after consulting with Senator Schottner, the vice chair, and legislative council, we thought possibly we would do what we do in our normal standing committees, and that is to say, you can nod your heads. I can see that. We can all see that. But as far as applaud or boos, let's not do that and go with the normal rules that we would otherwise. So appreciate all of your passion. Certainly feel and understand that and know the why behind it. So that is enough of a prelude after lunch. And Kurt Ely, the Director of Student Services from Waunakee Community School District, is joining us, and he told me that he would get us back on schedule. So we'll let him go.
All right, well, thank you. I also appreciate, hi, Ann. I also appreciate your comments about clapping and booing, because I might be one of those people who might be inclined to boo. No, I don't think so. I understand the work of this committee, and I certainly do appreciate that. In my career as a school psychologist, which is my original training, and then now as my work as a Director of Special Education Student Services, this is something that I have struggled with because families and kids have struggled with this for 30 years, and I'm beginning my 30th year this coming year in education. I would take you back even further. This isn't a new conversation. My mother is 90 years old, and she was a teacher for many, many years. And she would talk to me when I was trying to figure out my path in life, and as far as a career goes, she would talk to me about reading and the conversations that existed way back then when she was a teacher and just being trained in what was called a normal school. I'm not quite sure what that is, but that's where she was trained and became a teacher. So this isn't something that's new, but it is something that I hope we can all come together and come up with a solution so that we don't have students who are strugglers forever, because when you struggle in reading, you struggle pretty much your whole life. It is a constant battle that you have to overcome, and that leads to many other things. My first bullet there is I am not a reading expert. I don't portray myself to be one. I leave that up to the people who've gone into that profession or that area of the profession of education to be the reading experts. And I hope that you will have an opportunity, and I know you have somebody coming on after me who can provide you with some information on that. What I hope to share with you today, and some of what you're going to hear from me, you've already heard, either from the opening remarks from Jessica and Julia, or from the two doctors who spoke this morning, as well as some of the individual comments from members of your committee. What I do hope that I can bring, in addition to that, is something that Mike said, is some districts who have been successful. Waunakee has a tradition of performing well on all of the assessments, whether it be the NAEP, whether it be the Forward, the Badger, the WKCE, the whatever. Waunakee is a pretty high performing district overall. I will share some of the challenges that even we have as a high performing district and that just exist. And I know in rural Wisconsin, in suburban Wisconsin like Waunakee, and urban Wisconsin, districts are in all different places with a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about and that you are going to be talking about over the next several meetings that you're going to have as you come to hopefully a direction on providing some assistance as we move forward. So I have up on the screen right now just kind of the various topics that I'm going to be talking about. Again, you're going to see some of them are topics that have already been shared and discussed, but I'm hoping to take them to a different level and to share with you some specifics about how Waunakee is doing some of these things and some of the challenges that I know exist across the state of Wisconsin as we're working with students and their families. This morning, I think it was Dr. Gustafson shared that there is an agreed upon definition of dyslexia. What I put on the board, and I'm not going to get into any kind of a debate about that, I just put 4 different definitions of dyslexia that I found. One, I just Googled dyslexia. That's the first one that I came up with. The second one is from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th edition. Third one is from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, and then the last one is from the International Dyslexia Association. So I just share that because not so much about dyslexia, but when I talk about special education and how we identify students in special education, we need to be very clear what we're identifying, because that helps us determine the information that we're going to be gathering to make that determination. So some of the challenges. This is kind of an overview. I will get into these in more detail as I'm working my way through my presentation. You definitely are going to hear about differences if you talk to districts across the state of Wisconsin, and you're going to find differences between rural districts, between urban districts, and between suburban districts, let alone differences between those different categories of districts. And a lot of that has to do with some of the things toward the bottom of that list, which as I get to those, I will talk about those. One thing I want to talk about, because I do not have a separate slide on that, is student engagement. When students, for whatever reason, become disengaged, and a lot of it is because they struggle in reading, and then they get turned off to the education process. Once students become disengaged, it is very difficult to re-engage them because they get so frustrated with not being able to read, if that's what is leading to their disengagement. It could be their inability to sustain or maintain attention. It could be a variety of other reasons. But the common denominator is when students become disengaged, it is hard to bring them back to the table to re-engage them. So anything that can be done in a preventive way so that they don't come to that level of frustration where they just say, this isn't worth it anymore, is something that I hope we can all work toward. Because that's when we really get into the behavioral issues that then begin to interfere with learning. We also then, because students oftentimes will end up in a principal's office or an assistant principal's office and may be suspended or even worse, expelled, which is the ultimate of disengagement, that just compounds the problems that we have. So anything that we can do to focus on maintaining student engagement is the direction that I personally feel that we should try to work toward. So how do districts go about identifying students who are delayed in reading? It was talked this morning several different times about this universal screening that we need to do in grades 4K through grade 2, and that was done through the bill that also has been discussed many times. In Wanakee, we have still chosen to use the PALS assessment for our universal screening. The PALS is given, just because there was some question about when is it given, the PALS is given in Wanakee, the PALS is given in the fall for all students in grades 4K through 2. We then do a winter screening for students who in grades K through 2 who either are at or below a certain cutoff score or who have moved into the district since that fall screening. Okay. We also do that for our 4K students in the winter, is we will screen them if they have moved in and missed that fall screening or they were at one of our cutoff scores. If they're at that benchmark, we will not screen them, any student, in the winter time. And in the spring, we screen all of our 4K students, and we screen again in grades K through 2. We screen those targeted cutoff students again in Wanakee. That's how we do it in Wanakee. I think there's some variability across the state of Wisconsin in regards to that. So in Wanakee, we have, for years, we did the MAPS assessment, which I believe somebody had mentioned this morning as well. We actually changed a few years ago to the STAR assessment. And the reason we changed, again, something that you heard this morning, was there was a time factor involved. The STAR assessment is a shorter amount of time it takes to administer the STAR than it does the MAPS. We use in Wanakee, we use the STAR Reading Enterprise, which does cover the fundamental skills that include phonological awareness and phonics and word recognition. So it's not the STAR Lite like Dr. Gustafson had mentioned. In Wanakee, we use the full assessment, the enterprise. We also monitor student progress throughout the year. We certainly use the Fontes and Pinnell benchmarking system, which I'll talk about a little bit more as we get into our total balanced literacy program that we use in Wanakee. We do use the Fontes and Pinnell. We do use AimsWeb, which was one of the tools that was on the screen Dr. Gustafson had on in his presentation. We also do the STAR assessments. We use that for our progress monitoring, again, for some of our targeted students as we need to. That one we do use the more light version than the enterprise version in Wanakee. How do we, as a school district, typically become aware of an individual with dyslexia? Well, it's typically because a parent had a concern about their child and they went and they received an evaluation through a clinic. We certainly have had students in Wanakee who've been seen by Dr. Gustafson. Dr. Williamson was an individual in the Madison area for many years. He is now retired, but he was an individual who not only did evaluations, but he would actually come to the school district upon completion of an evaluation and sit down with us as a school team and go over the results of his evaluation and be a part of the conversation about what we would do and how we would approach the student who was identified with dyslexia. So a lot of times I find out about it as the director of student services because a parent either gives a report to a teacher or to the principal and says that my child has been identified with dyslexia by a doctor or a clinician of some kind, and then we start the conversation at that point. That generally involves me following up with the principal and the teachers or the staff to learn about what information do we have that may corroborate this information or what's different about the information. One of the things that I find a little frustrating, not something that I don't think we can overcome, and again, it kind of depends on the individual providing the evaluation. Many of these evaluations, not just evaluations with dyslexia, but evaluations for attention deficit disorder, are really done in isolation of the school district's involvement. The clinician or the practitioner doesn't contact us to get any information from us, to learn about what are we doing, what assessments might we have done already. It's pretty much the first time we hear about it is when the evaluation has been completed and then the results are shared with us. It would really be helpful, in my opinion, if the school and the outside provider were part of the evaluation together. We both have a lot of information that I think we can share across systems and have a more comprehensive evaluation than either us as a school doing an evaluation or the practitioner doing an evaluation. If it's a collaborative effort, we can share what we're doing, we wouldn't duplicate some of the assessments that we do. Some of the tools that we use are the exact same tools that Dr. Gustafson will use, some of the assessments. Sometimes they get administered to students twice as part of the process, either their process to identify dyslexia or our process to look at special education eligibility. So if there's a way that we could collaborate on that, I think that would be, on the front end, I think that would be very helpful and very useful. In this morning's presentation, there was a portion of the DPI guidance on dyslexia. The document is 2 pages long. I do have a hard copy of it, but I did put a hyperlink in my presentation if you wanted to take a look at that entire document. That document has been around for a long time. The most recent update was in 2016, but it has existed longer than that, the department put together. In fact, when Stephanie Petska was the special ed director at the Department of Public Instruction is when that document was originally put together, and she has been happily retired for many years. So what is the process in school districts, or at least in Waunakee? A lot of my comments are going to be specific to Waunakee, but there are some general practices that are used across school districts. You certainly, this morning, learned about the RTI model and the pyramid model. In a minute, I'm going to be showing you a slide that's a little bit different than that, and it's a slide that comes out of the Waunakee School District's RTI manual that we are putting together. It's actually the next slide. But you certainly need to have a universal or general education instruction. That has to be your core program. And that does have to be sound. I totally agree with the presenters from this morning. If your universal program isn't sound, then in some respects, you actually are making exclusionary factors when you consider special education as a disability. And I will talk more about that when I get to that portion of the special education evaluation. So you certainly have to have that sound universal instruction component. I would differ a little bit from my colleague or from the speakers this morning in saying that a one-size-fits-all model is appropriate. I don't know that that's appropriate for anything. And I'm actually going to use an example from the medical arena to share. I have a diagnosis of ulcerative colitis. It can be very debilitating when there's flare-ups or when I have a compounding diverticulitis. I'm not treated the same way every time I report that to my gastroenterologist. He listens to my symptoms and he talks about what I need, and then he adjusts my treatment based on the information that I share with him. So if you're looking at a universal curriculum or a general program that might be all phonics based, I don't know, I really don't believe that that's going to meet the needs of all the kids who are especially those kids who do respond from a whole language approach, which is what we use in Waunakee, is we use the balanced literacy approach. I think you're going to lose some of those kids because some of those kids are not going to be engaged in the instructional pieces of that program. I just think you're going to lose a few kids. So we often get a referral then based on that evaluation that identified dyslexia. And how do we process through that in the world of special education? So we're going to look for, in the special ed world, we're going to look for a disability area, which actually is first an impairment. You need to meet a criteria of impairment, and then you have to document a need for some specialized instruction or special education. And if you meet those two components, then we will develop an individualized education program for those students. Most likely, we are going to be looking at a specific learning disability, but I do know some districts, because dyslexia is a medical diagnosis, I do know some school districts are using other health impairment as the disability category to identify. Also, Section 504 is an area that we would look at. In Wanakee, we always approach it from a special education evaluation first, because that's the most comprehensive evaluation, and the criteria is different than the criteria for meeting a disability under Section 504. Under Section 504, there aren't the hard numbers that I'm going to talk about in just a moment when I walk through the specific learning disability criteria. It's, does this physical or mental impairment impact a major life activity, which certainly reading is a major life activity, and does it impact in the educational setting? And if you meet those two standards, then we would develop an accommodation plan which could include special education and related services. Again, it's a little bit how your district, your individual district, may interpret that in regards to if special education would be part of a 504 plan. In general, the answer is probably going to be no. I'll be honest. In general, the answer is probably going to be no. One of the reasons for that, the primary reason for that, is reimbursement on the staff salary and benefits that comes with an IEP, but does not come with a Section 504 plan. In order for you to receive special ed categorical aid, that is only for positions that are 100% special ed dedicated. So if you introduce non-special education students and they're getting services from a special education teacher, that time is no longer categorically aidable, okay? That's a big issue. That is a huge issue, because districts need the categorical aid, every penny that they can get. And I'm going to talk about that when I get to the financial competition part of the presentation. In the end, and I know nobody likes to talk about how a lot of things are contingent upon dollars and cents, but a lot of this is related to dollars and cents. It's dollars and cents that are coming out of the pockets of parents and families, and it's dollars and cents that districts have to try to meet the needs of all the kids that we have that come through our doors. So the next slide then is our visual in Wanakee of the RTI model. Again, I suppose one could say it's a reverse pyramid if you take that slide and kind of tip it and put the universal curriculum on the bottom, our point, and then we go up. But this is how we have visualized. We start with that universal core instruction. And within that, we do differentiation as needed for students. And I have another couple visuals later that will talk to you about what that might look like. Then we have some selected interventions that we will do with some of our students. The red area is really those intensive interventions that directly relate to students and their eligibility for special education. All right. Here at your desk, you should have found actually a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, as well as another packet that has some slides that I didn't know how they would project. They actually project pretty well, but I hope that you were able to find those. This slide is a visualization of the Wanakee School District's balanced literacy components for grades K through 6. You will see embedded in here that there are components of phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, vocabulary, particularly in that individualized guided practice component. Again, I'm not portraying myself as an expert in reading or literacy. I'm sharing this because one of the things that I thought would be helpful is for you to see a district that as a whole, we do pretty well with our students. Do we have some students in all of the different levels of intervention? We absolutely do. and we have students who are in our special education programs who are receiving instruction as well in reading. But as a whole, this visual document just provides the different elements and where we do incorporate phonics instruction into our total universal program for literacy. The second handout that you have, which does look different than this one, when I cut and pasted it into my PowerPoint, it changed its colorization, I think, more so than anything. But again, this is just another way to illustrate how our universal fits with our selective interventions and then fits in our intensive interventions and how we progress through those different layers. Again, this is part of our RTI handbook that we have put together. It is always a work in progress because it is something that we look at every single year and we make adjustments to it based on our experience from the previous year. So it's always a work in progress. It is where we are right now and where we are looking to go into the future. As you as a committee are looking at some suggestions or some recommendations to come out of this, again, I'm not sure how they fit into the law or writing a piece of legislation, but I think if districts have a formalized document to illustrate what they are doing, if there's some guidance as to what components should be there, or requirements, I think that would be helpful for districts because then you would have some level of consistency across the state, where right now I think districts are developing their own process or their own procedure, and there's just going to be differences based on people who are in the district at the time that something is created who may not be there, or given the backgrounds of that person could reflect some of those differences. So when we're looking at placing students in these different levels of intervention, what is our process? We use a problem-solving team process. On the far right-hand side, we have different team members based on what we are doing. So when we do our universal screening each time, we assemble this team and they look at the results of that screener, the STAR. We will also introduce other data such as the Fontes and Pinnell information that we have, other assessments that teachers may have. And we look at all of the information and then we make a determination as to where the student is. A heavier weight certainly is put on the STAR data, and the reason for that is we're looking at those cutoffs and those established cutoffs, which I will actually go to the next screen to show you what we use as cutoffs in Wanakee. So we have 4 different categories of students, and they're all based on percentiles. And again, that was a statistic property that Dr. Gustafson talked about. Percentile is probably the easiest statistical property for people to understand. I like to, in many of the meetings that I am a participant in, I will sit and I will draw a bell-shaped curve because it's very easy to illustrate on a bell-shaped curve these different cutoff and the percentiles. So in Wanakee, if a student is on or above the 45th percentile, we really don't do anything for them but continue on with that core curriculum, that universal piece that I illustrated before. When they are in the 36th to 44th percentile in Wanakee, we actually have them in a selected category. They're on a watch list. What will happen here is the regular education teacher will do some interventions within their own classroom. Okay. When they get into the intervention phase, which is the 25th to 35th percentile, Then we ramp it up a little bit more. And I'm going to actually go forward, this is part of your handout. It's the last page of your handout. We will go to the selected, the orange section of the handout. What this illustrates is some of the interventions we used based on the skill that we are finding where the student is struggling, okay? Again, this orange section is done by the general education teacher. All of them have been trained in LLI, or the vast majority of them have been trained in LLI, so they will be the providers of that intervention, as they are with the other ones that are listed. When we get to the next category, which is below the 25th percentile, they are now in the intensive category. Okay? This is where the reading specialist becomes involved and takes over. What I've done, or what this chart shows, and this comes out of our curriculum office, what this chart shows is the types of interventions we use. That far right-hand column provides you with some information in regards to how many sessions, how long a session is, how many days a week. So that gives you some information about that. All of these interventions have varying lengths of minutes per session, number of session, weeks. So districts have to choose from a list, and I provide you another hyperlink later in the PowerPoint to a website that we use to take a look at the interventions. And all of these interventions have been researched or evidence-based. I, too, am a little skeptical of that concept of evidence research-based interventions. If you pay enough money, you can get any intervention to be evidence research-based and show its effectiveness. Many of the companies that produce some of these interventions do their own research. And of course, it's going to be good, otherwise they're not going to sell their product. So there's always a little bit of skepticism that I have when somebody tells me this is the latest and greatest and here's all the evidence and the research behind it, because you really have to take a look at the information. As a school psychologist, we had to do some research projects as part of our program when I was at UW-Whitewater. And if you don't have a background in analyzing if the research is done well, it's hard to know if it's done well or not, and the conclusions that they draw from that. So I do get a little skeptical about evidence research-based. At the very end, I'm going to show you 2 slides where we actually have done a study in Wanakee. And that's really where I put my stock in, is give me an intervention, put it in practice, see how the kids do, and then make your own decision if this is a good intervention or not. That's really the only way you know if it's going to work for you. Because a lot of these studies, you don't necessarily know the backgrounds of the students that are part of the study, and any intervention can be dependent upon various factors that are not related to the intervention at all. It can be related to who was in the intervention and other factors as well, like fidelity, which was discussed again this morning. So when we get to the red level and we have students in these interventions, what do we have to do? So here's that hyperlink to the National Center on Intensive Interventions, and they list numerous interventions from different categories, not just reading. Math is in there as well. Writing is in there as well. So if you have a spare moment, I would just suggest you go out there, because it provides you with a lot of different kinds of information. It talks about how much time Do these interventions have to be put into place before you can make a conclusion if it is working for that student or not? So it goes from minutes, number of sessions, weeks. Some of these can take up to a year before you're really supposed to draw a conclusion if the intervention is working or not. It also will provide you with the minimum intervention requirements. It isn't all teacher required or reading specialist required. It can be trained individuals, which I have a sense there are a few tutors in the room who have done work and have been trained in many of these interventions. So it doesn't have to be a teacher. Some of the interventions that we use in our school district, paraeducators are the ones who are implementing the interventions. So it doesn't have to be a reading specialist or a teacher who are implementing these interventions. What I did is I just randomly pulled 2 interventions out so that I could do and share with you a side-by-side comparison. These are interventions that we currently use Sound Partners. We no longer use Read 180. Part of the reason that we don't use Read 180, as you can see by the, it's not because we didn't find it to be an effective intervention. It was just too time intensive for us to do it, and for us to do it right. Because with all interventions, when we get to this level of intensive interventions, these interventions are in addition to the core curriculum. They're not replacing it, they're in addition to. As you can see by the Read 180 intervention, since it really is a 90-minute session 5 weeks a day, you're taking a large chunk of the student's time just for the intervention. And then on top of that, you have to do the core instructional program and then try to fit everything else in: math, writing, phy-ed, art, music. There just isn't enough time to do that. So we've really moved away from the Read 180 piece because we couldn't do it with a level of fidelity that needed to be done. But there are a lot of districts who still use Read 180 as an intervention. But I think what these 2 side-by-side comparisons can do is just show you the huge range that interventions can bring to the table, which I think is challenging for school districts to try to navigate and negotiate, because we also are trying to do a lot of other things in a set school day. And I think that's where it gets challenging. I'm not saying that we don't make decisions about prioritizing things. Have we taken students out of other classes like maybe art or music or Spanish? We teach Spanish. We begin our students in kindergarten learning Spanish in Wanakee. We've done that for a number of years, but for some of the students who need the extra reading intervention, we will remove them from some of those classes because we have to find the time someplace to do it. Finding the time. So what I'm going to share with you now is talking more about this finding the time. Some of our students, not only are they struggling in reading, but they also struggle in math. And we do a very similar structure of math interventions that we do for reading interventions. So again, in order to do those interventions with fidelity, which you need to do in order to come to the conclusion of a learning disability, a specific learning disability, you have to try to find the time. So I'm going to walk you through a 1st grade schedule and then a 3rd grade schedule. This again is the Wanakee 1st grade schedule at one of our elementary schools. Hot off the presses. If anybody knows anybody in Wanakee with a 1st grader, you could share this and you can tell them what their schedule is going to be for next year, because this came from our Prairie Elementary principal. So we begin our school day promptly at 7:40 in the morning at K through 4. We do about 20 minutes of opening activities. Again, that incorporates lunch count. What are you taking for lunch? What are you going to do for lunch? just kind of an opening activities of connecting with the kids to start to build those relationships every day. That 8 to 8:30 time is our designated intervention and enrichment time. That is when we try to do our intensive interventions that we just talked about. So that would be the LLI piece or the Sound Partners piece, or if it's a math intervention, it would be a math intervention piece. We also use this time for some of our advanced learners to take them, our gifted and talented students. We call them pathways in Wanakee, but we also use that half hour to enrich their learning as well. Then this particular homeroom is going to have 30 minutes of social studies science. Those are on rotating days. We give them a 20-minute recess. Then we roll into a large English language arts block. This particular homeroom, it also comes back after lunch and recess for another chunk of time of English language arts. Then we roll into an hour of math, and then this particular homeroom will end their day with encore classes, which are those art, music, Fayed, Spanish, guidance lessons, and library time. Then at 2:30, we have to run shuttle buses amongst our 3 elementary schools because at various grade levels, we don't have enough room for all of the students in an attendance area, so we have to force transfer them from one elementary attendance area to another. And so we have to have 10 minutes at the end of the day so that we can get all those kids to the right elementary school so that they can get on the right bus to go home at 2:40. And we end our day at 2:40 at the elementary school. That's our first grade schedule. Similarly, our third grade schedule, and I'm not going to walk through this in the detail that I did with first grade, but as you can see, we really only have 30 minutes a day, K through 6, to work on those intensive interventions with students. And again, if a student is not only struggling in reading, but they're also struggling in math or behavior, social emotional learning, where do we find the time to do these things? What are the things that we're going to sacrifice in order to provide that other instruction that we might need to do? So that's one of our challenges with finding the time. So to qualify under a specific learning disability, there are 3 components to the criteria. One is insufficient classroom achievement, which is based on the administration of a standardized achievement test. Depending on how closely you were looking at the slides with Dr. Gustafson, one of the instruments that we use, that he uses, is the Woodcock-Johnson Psychoeducational Battery. We use that tool. We also use the Wechsler Intelligence or Individual Achievement Test as another tool. So element 1 of the criteria is you have to have a standard score on that assessment of 81.25 or less. Here's where some of those statistical pieces get complicated and difficult for parents to understand because they're just not trained in standard deviations and standard scores and scaled scores and things like that. That's one element. If you don't have that element, technically the student doesn't meet specific learning disability, even though dyslexia is written in the criteria as a condition or an impairment that would meet specific learning disability. You still have to have that score. You also have to look at exclusionary factors. You have to look at limited English proficiency. You have to look at, has the student been participating in appropriate general instruction in the area of concern, reading for the purposes of dyslexia. You have to look at environmental, cultural, or economic factors or other impairments. When I was a school psychologist, when I started my career in Mineral Point, Wisconsin, one of the things, and this was an environmental factor that we often talked about I wouldn't say that I ever used it as an exclusionary factor for a student. But one of the environmental factors was the lead content in the water in Mineral Point is extremely high. And our incident, when I was there, again, now this is from 1989 to 1997 when I was in Mineral Point, we had a significantly higher percentage of students who identified with learning disabilities in Mineral Point than other parts of the state where there wasn't that concentration of lead and lead particles and in the water. So there certainly are environmental factors that come into play. Again, I personally did not use, I probably could have, but I personally did not use that exclusionary factor because in Mineral Point, we didn't have a lot of resources available to us. It was pretty much special education or nothing for students. And I have always operated under, I would like to provide students services to students if there's any way that I can. So I know I personally kind of overlooked that exclusionary factor and the student maybe met criteria and we placed them in programming. Of course, that was also under a different model of identification than we have now. That was under a Tinker-Bond formula of calculation. The last component there, insufficient progress in one or more of the 8 areas, that is really your RTI model in practice. That is where you have to have the intensive interventions. The students have to fail to make progress in those intensive interventions. They also cannot be done at the same time. You have to do one intervention at a time. So if one intervention takes 16 weeks, the second intervention takes another 16 weeks or even longer, you can't make a decision until after that. You take those 2 amounts of time, whatever they are. In my example, it was 36 weeks. You can't make a determination. That's a long time in a kid's life to be waiting to make a decision if they're going to qualify for a special education program. But that's what we have right now in our system. So I do believe not waiting for special education is the right answer because it takes too long. It takes you a long time to get into special ed if you're even going to get there, because a lot of students who are identified with dyslexia will not meet that first one, the 81.25. They score higher than that. They're scoring in the 85s to 90s on many of those tests because they have learned other strategies to compensate for their weaknesses in reading. So therefore, they don't qualify for the special education services. A couple of other components in regards to meeting the criteria is the fidelity of the intervention. Students do need to participate in 80% of the week's sessions and minutes of instruction. We do have some students who miss a lot of days of school. Some of that could be avoiding coming to school because of their frustrations, because school is hard for them. So they just don't come to school because they're physically sick. They may not be physically sick like the flu, but they're physically sick because of the anxiety that they have because school is so hard for them. If they're not meeting that level of fidelity, then that intervention wouldn't be an intervention that we would be able to use for special ed consideration. We also have to check to make sure that the people doing the intervention are doing them in accordance with the design of the intervention. So our curriculum office is actually in Wanakee, the group of people. Our curriculum director and assistant curriculum director are the people who go out and observe the reading specialists to provide that verification that they're providing the intervention to the level of fidelity that it needs to be based on the literature of the intervention. It's not a set. It varies by the intervention.
We have about half a dozen slides left. I don't want to speed
Okay.
up, but I just wanted to allow for some.
Oh, perfect. All right. Perfect. So, professional development. Here's where these next slides really all cover very similar things, and they talk about a lot of things that you've heard, But I think one of them that overarches everything is really the competition for dollars piece of it all. In Wanakee, we have the luxury that we are a growing district. We grow about 75 to 80 students a year. That generates significant additional revenue for us every year. If you're not a growing district, you're in a world of hurt for finances in the state of Wisconsin. Because we're a growing district, we have the luxury to have full-time reading specialists, full-time literacy coaches in every single building, including high school. We have school safety initiatives that we're trying to fund. The state has been very generous in giving us safety grants this year, but in an effort to make schools as safe as possible, we're trying to take school safety to a new level. We have maintenance projects that we try to balance too, roofs, boilers, furnaces, all of those things that you kind of have to have in order to operate a school. Staff mobility and retention is a new issue, really, that's come out in the last 4 or 5 years. In Wanakee, we are losing teachers and other staff to neighboring districts because they'll make more money in the next district. I've had people leave because they're making $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 more in the school district next to me that we can't pay them and justify paying them. With all of that, some of the slides that I skipped through, comes that professional development piece. We offer a lot of professional development. I have trained people in Orton-Gillingham. I have trained people in the Sonday system, which is an Orton-Gillingham-based reading program. When a staff member moves and then you replace them, if they don't have that training, now you have to double back and train all over again. So if there's a way that we can retain people and not have to recycle some of the professional development that we have to recycle, that would be a wonderful thing to do. Professional development is also in and of itself a very competitive area because we have so many things that we need to train people on. Not just reading, but we have to train people on things like nonviolent crisis intervention. We need to train people on how to respond in a crisis situation, like an active shooter situation. On the bottom there, I have listed some resources, the Title I money and services that are available. Title I gets cut pretty much every year. There's less Title I money that districts can use to work with students in reading. Special ed categorical aid is down to 25% now. When I started in this field, it was over 30%. We're down to 25%. And that last figure, at the end of the year, districts have to transfer money from the general fund to cover the costs in the special education fund. This figure, $1 billion is what's going to be transferred from general ed dollars to special ed dollars in order to cover those costs. So if you're looking at that, if there was more special ed funding available, there in theory is more general ed funding available because districts would have to transfer less money to the general fund, from the general fund to the special ed fund to cover the costs of providing those special education services. I do want to share just this quickly. We did a study. We looked at students that we had in the red zone in 2014, 2015. We looked at them 3 years later to see where they were. So if you think about it, all of these students were in the red zone, okay? We have moved some kids out of the red zone with the program that we have in place. What we've noticed is it varies by year, by grade, and you'll also see that blue on the bottom are students who moved out of our district. So there is an element of student mobility that's a factor when we're working with students who are struggling readers, because sometimes parents, for whatever reason, because a spouse takes a job someplace else or they get frustrated with the school district, they do move out of the district. But overall, I think you can see the things that we are doing, we are showing improvement with our students. If you look at the far right column, 47 students moved from red to green, which means they are on target after 3 years of work. And I will conclude with that.
Well, thank you very much for coming in. I do, as usual, have a lot of questions, but I will defer to the rest of the committee to have any questions or, and if we could actually, typically in a legislative standing committee, the committee is to ask questions of the person giving testimony rather than to actually give testimony themselves. I'm not going to be real hard and fast on that rule, but try to, if you have a comment you want to make, form it into the form of a question and see how that works for you. So, thank you. Stephen Dykstra, please.
I'm going to try to do what you just said. A lot of your intervention seems to focus a lot at different levels on the Fountas and Pinnell materials, correct? LLI was mentioned a great deal.
That's
You
true.
rely heavily on their assessment materials, heavily on their training. And you made the point that everybody says they're research-based because they go out and they hire somebody they tip all the scales in their favor. So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to try to follow his instruction. Are you aware of a study that Fountas and Pinnell puts out that they refer to as their gold standard study?
I am not, but I'm also not
Right.
in Wanakee, the right person
Would
to
you
ask
be
that
interested to,
question.
note the question, would you be interested to know that they paid a company to do a study, they tipped all the scales in their favor, the kids in the control group got nothing, they actually got an extra recess. And at the end of 34 weeks, from kindergarten through second grade, on objective testing, kids in Fountas Pinnell did no better than kids who got an extra recess.
For me, that is very interesting.
I'll circulate that with the whole committee, because I think it illustrates a point that you made, that sometimes we have to dig through the research. And the front page of that study, by the way, says, great results. But then if you read the study,
And I don't doubt that. I believe that.
yeah, I'll send that to you and to
That'd
everybody
be
else. in the
fabulous,
committee.
thanks. And I will share that with my CNI folks.
Question I have is, how, if in any way do you think that your method could be improved? Let's take, for instance, the PALS test. Is that bulletproof? Is that perfect? What's the next step for you in Wanakee? Because, it looks like you've come a ways, but I'm still seeing some kids in the red. What's the next step?
Yeah, I think it's something that we review every year. We look at our data, we look at our methods, we try to bring in additional resources. I mentioned during my presentation, probably 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, for 2 consecutive years, I brought in an Orton-Gillingham trainer into the district. The Orton-Gillingham trainer, it was open to anybody. I had, I required my special ed teachers to be there. I think all of our reading specialists were there, and some of our regular ed teachers were there. I think it's the continuing of bringing in resources and continuing to provide the professional development with whatever the strategy is. Because if you're not properly trained in the strategy, you can't provide the level of fidelity with the implementation that you need to really know, is it the strategy that it's the problem, or is it the implementation that is the problem and not leading to the results that you would like to see?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
What percentage of your students are SLD?
The percentage, that's a really good question. It is very small, and it is smaller than it used to be. I don't know that I could tell you off the top of my head. We only, as a district, our incidence rates of students with disabilities, all categories, is between 8 and 9%.
Okay. And
It's
my
quite small.
And my second question is, you stated that you have 2 16-week intervention periods, which is a total of 32. So that's basically a school year. So what happens to those students that are failing the intervention after the first, both interventions? What happens to those kids?
Well, the actual amount of intervention is dependent upon the actual intervention put into play. I just randomly picked those 16 weeks, saying that the interventions would be 16 weeks. They might not be. But if after that 2 periods of intervention, whatever the length is, then that's when we would be looking at the SLD criteria.
So you're saying within a year, there's a potential for that student to get an SLD or to get a referral for special ed?
It's true that it could take that long.
Well, that's okay. I mean, that's not the worst, but, so how long do they stay then? So if they're not making gains, can they potentially continue for 18 months, 2 years, 2.5, 3 years?
If they're not making gains in 2 interventions, we wouldn't continue them in those interventions, no. We would identify a specific learning disability, put them in the special education program, and then we would use a different intervention.
Okay. Does your Title I staff, how do they play into the intervention system?
That would be our reading specialists. They are the people doing the red intervention on the chart. They're the red interventionists,
Okay,
working with the students who are at the 25th percentile or lower.
okay, thank you.
You mentioned a degree of frustration over the collaboration or lack thereof on the early end relative to diagnosis. I guess, where should that come from? Because you indicated that sometimes you kind of were surprised by all of a sudden having a parent come with a child with a medical diagnosis. Is that not partially the school district's responsibility or the teacher's responsibility? Again, I don't want to, it's not about blame, but it's a question. Just how can that collaboration be furthered and made better?
I think that's a really good question, and I'm not sure that I have an answer for that question because it kind of depends on the source of the evaluation, whether it's ours or the outside provider's evaluation. Schools, I think in general, are reluctant to suggest that a parent goes somewhere for an outside evaluation because we could be stuck footing the bill for that evaluation. So we're going to be reluctant to say, go get an evaluation someplace. I know from personal experience, because I had my son evaluated when he was in 2nd or 3rd grade for attention deficit disorder with Dr. Williamson, who I had mentioned. I, as a parent, went there because I knew he was the person in the Madison area at that time to go to. But because I was also connected with the school, I was able to involve the school in the conversation with Dr. Williamson as he was doing his evaluation, because I wanted him to know what the teachers are experiencing when my son is in their classroom. That's the part that I don't know happens very often, is that when a child is evaluated by Dr. Gustafson, some students who live in Wanakee are evaluated by him. I'm not aware that his office is reaching out to get information from the school staff. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes we will get rating scales or we will get a formal request for information from the evaluator, the outside evaluator, but that does not always happen. And then we just get the evaluation.
Excellent. Senator Schattner.
My question is there a percentage of students who are evaluated outside because the parents feel like the school evaluation is not accurate? Or do they come back the same? Is there any way to know, are the evaluations come back with the same results or are they different?
Many times, because we use some of the same tools, assessment tools, the results are similar, but I think where our conclusions or Dr. Gustafson makes a diagnosis of dyslexia. we don't make a diagnosis of dyslexia. We make an identification of specific learning disability. So that's where our differences really come into play. Now, when Dr. Williamson used to come out and meet with our staff after he conducted an evaluation, or even some of the evaluations that we get from some of the other providers, there will be a list of suggestions or recommendations that are in there. Many of those recommendations are not different than things that we've either been doing or would do now that we have some more information about it.
So just to follow up, so is there a importance for that diagnosis versus determination of disability? Is there a benefit to one over the other?
Well, if you're looking at special education, the answer is yes. If you're not looking at special education, no, there isn't.
Okay.
Thank you.
Brenda Warren, just before you ask your question, for the rest of you that don't serve on standing committees, if you do what Brenda did a little while ago, just get my attention or Senator Schottner, we can kind of scan the room and put you on a list. That way it's not, that way when the list is done, we move on to the next person. So Brenda Warren, please.
In the RTI process, the universal curriculum, universal instruction is so critical. What is your process in Wanakee for determining what instructional strategies or what curriculum should be part of that universal instruction to ensure that you have a curriculum that's based in the reading science?
That would all be handled by our curriculum office. It would be the staff that they would put together to make that determination.
Okay.
I wouldn't be a part of that. I'm not a part of that conversation.
Nancy Dressel.
I think you're in a very unique situation in that you have highly accredited evaluators, outside evaluators within this area. Other parts of the state don't have access to that.
Very true.
For example, living up towards Minnesota, we doctor in Minnesota. Minnesota felt that we needed to work through the school. The school felt you go to the medical professional, and it was only through other parents that we discovered an evaluating resource in Rochester, Minnesota. It was only an hour further to come down here to Madison, but that was literally the closest resource to get an evaluation, and I think that's how many of our constituents in the state are. Given that your area has such qualified outside evaluators, I'm curious if you have any data on how many students that have been diagnosed with dyslexia by an outside evaluator qualified for intervention, qualified for a 504, or qualified for a specific learning disability, and to look and see where these students are fitting into our educational system as it currently, the criteria currently serves them, and how they're progressing through the system. You know, is it truly serving students with this medical diagnosis? And if so, where in the system are they being served?
I don't have any hard data that would do that. I do know that some of the students that would be in our red category have no diagnosis at all from anybody, us, Dr. Gustafson, or anybody from outside. So I really don't have any data. I would like to just talk a little bit about that rural, where you are in the state, you're lucky or not. That's not only true for the identification, but it's also true then for the service part of it. Wanakee, Madison, we have the Children's Center that Ann was part of. We also have WILD, which is the Wisconsin Institute for Learning Disabilities and Dyslexia. We also have the Arnold Reading program. So, you know, in this area, there's a wealth of resources available for parents to get resources. Rural Wisconsin, you can go hundreds of miles and not have anything available to you.
And then we'll have Michael Weber last, and then we'll call that. So.
Good to see you again. And Wanakee, I think, is very, very blessed with exceptional teachers and just a great program. But who did your OG training, and are you aware that you probably need ongoing training for those that were initially
right.
trained, as well as and that all trainings are not equal without a practicum. It's pretty hard. And also, how much does Fontes and Pinal cost? And do you think once a district is invested in a particular reading program, that it's very, very hard to switch because of the cost? A three-part question, sorry.
Sure, sure. You are exactly right about the ongoing training with OG training. It was a while ago, I don't remember. I know it was from the Milwaukee area, but I don't remember who. It was expensive, you are exactly right. I know it was a full week of training. It was a full week of training is what they provided, yep. Like I said, I haven't offered it for the last 4 or 5 years because it is costly to do. It's hard to find the time to do it. In Wanakee, we have 4 staff development days for the whole school year. So if we're training during the school year, you get 1 this month, and then it's 2 months later, you get another day, 2 months later, you get another day, et cetera. If you do it during the summer, you have the additional cost of compensating the staff to come in during the summertime to train. So that's another barrier that comes into play. I do not know that. That would be a question for our curriculum office for the cost, what the cost of that is. Do we change programs? We have changed reading programs in the district over the years that I've been in Wanakee. We've changed. Again, it's a process that is used by the curriculum office to do that. We actually went through that process because we're changing our writing curriculum for next year. And they did that last year. They ran 2 pilots, had a committee review the results, and then make a selection. So it'd be a similar process when we're considering a change in reading or math or any other curriculum. But we have changed.
Excellent.
That's okay.
Michael Weber?
I'm good.
You're good? Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming in, Kurt. I greatly appreciate it. You've been helpful, and wish you a good rest of the day. Next up, we have Deborah Zarling from the Literacy Coordinator from the Oshkosh Area School District. I'm assuming that Deborah is in. Excellent, excellent. So. And I guess while she is getting situated for the committee, I'm trying to be sensitive to both all of our overall time as well as to the patience of the people who came to testify. So if I'm hitting that, that's good. If I'm not, slip me a note and tell me to either speed up or slow down, and I'll decide which side prevails. So. Deborah, welcome to the committee. Thanks for your patience and thanks for joining us this morning. Go ahead when you are ready. Green light goes on.
Green light, okay, thank you. I will go ahead and start. They're trying to pull up my presentation, my PowerPoint, but I can start without that. I'm going to apologize because I'm going to go ahead and read mine because that way I will make sure I make the points that I want to. First of all, as a state licensed reading specialist with a master's degree in reading, a master educator license, and as the literacy coordinator for a Wisconsin school district, I have extensive knowledge about the learning and teaching of literacy and about children who struggle to learn to read, especially at the elementary level. I have been an educator and literacy leader in the state of Wisconsin for over 35 years, successfully working with students who struggle with literacy acquisition, and I have been an ardent advocate of student learning. I have worked successfully in classrooms with students, classroom teachers, and reading specialists to provide expert instruction, and with principals and other administrators to help them know what to look for in effective literacy instruction. I'm committed to high-quality instruction, and I understand the importance of teacher expertise. My roles have also included teaching graduate-level classes in literacy intervention and research for literacy leaders. Additionally, I have participated in state-level committees working on standards and assessment and with national literacy committees. I am acutely aware of the issues surrounding the literacy performance of students in Wisconsin. I understand the complexities of literacy learning and instruction, and I have kept myself well informed of research in regards to literacy. These thoughts and comments today are my own and are not intended to fully represent the position of any specific district or organization. But given my work with educators throughout the state, I know that I echo the thoughts and concerns of many. My assumption is that we share a vision of Wisconsin as a state where all students are successful literacy learners. I've committed my life's work to making that vision a reality. We aren't there yet, but I'm not ready to give up. In many ways, we are closer than we have ever been before, and in other ways, we have only begun the journey. However, in over 35 years as an educator, all of them working in real schools and real classrooms with children, including struggling readers, as well as teachers and administrators, I have seen many initiatives come and go and learned many lessons. As a reading specialist, I have spent my professional life working to find a way to teach every child. My ability to observe and assess a student's strengths and needs has been key. I have an ongoing commitment to read professionally, attend workshops, conferences, symposia, institutes, and other forms of professional development in order to continue to grow as an educator. I have a wide variety of possibilities in my toolkit, and I'm able to draw on those tools as needed to respond to the needs of children, as well as teachers and administrators. I have never met a child I couldn't teach, although some have taken much more time, effort, and problem solving than others. My experiences with teaching struggling readers have taught me that there is no one-size-fits-all answer. Do you remember how you learned to read? Many of us learned in different ways, and most of us don't know or don't even think about how we learned. We just did it. For some, it was easy. For others, it was a struggle. When I was in school, I read from books where kids and their pets did a lot of running and looking. I didn't know it then, but that method is now commonly referred to as the whole word approach. People who learned from Dick and Jane type programs often think they learned phonics, although in reality there was very little phonics taught through that program. However, in many schools, including mine, that learning was supplemented by a phonics program. Many students learned without difficulty, while others struggled. When I began to teach, the books and programs had changed, but we generally included a variety of types of instruction, including learning words and learning phonics. We continued to see students who struggled to learn to read. Throughout the years, different types of reading instruction have dominated. When one approach didn't work as promised, it was generally abandoned and a new model was adopted. Regardless of the approach in vogue at any one time, none of the models eradicated the issue of struggling readers or the need for extra support for some learners. But we have learned some important lessons about more effective ways to teach literacy and the complexity of the factors that influence learning. In 1997, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development was tasked with establishing a committee that would review existing research and determine once and for all the best ways of teaching children to read. The work of the committee was widely misinterpreted, and a number of issues were brought to light after the National Reading Panel report was released. Despite the issues and concerns, the results of this report were codified in the No Child Left Behind, or NCLB, reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and in the reauthorization of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, generally referred to as IDEA, in 2004. NCLB was again reauthorized in 2015 as the Every Student Succeeds Act, and the references to the National Reading Panel report and the restrictive guidelines that came with it were generally removed, but they are still in effect as part of IDEA. The impact of these laws is relevant in that in many schools and districts, much of the support for students who struggle with reading comes from one or both of these sources, and therefore they are required to follow the regulations of the laws. In regular education, this support is through Title I of the ESEA, and under IDEA, that support is provided through qualification for special education. The recommendations of the National Reading Panel report were also used as the foundation for a couple of large-scale studies which were funded as part of NCLB. $6 billion in federal funds were set aside to promote, and I quote, instructional practices that have been validated by scientific research. The legislation explicitly defines scientifically based reading research and outlines the specific activities state, district, and school grantees are to carry out based upon such research, end quote. Reading First funding could only be used for reading curricula and materials that focus on the 5 essential components of reading instruction, professional development and coaching for teachers on how to use scientifically based reading practices and how to work with struggling readers, and diagnosis and prevention of early reading difficulties through student screening, interventions for struggling readers, and monitoring of student progress. In spite of the inclusion of vocabulary and comprehension, in practice, professional development and instruction focus largely on phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency. Other factors which were not studied by the panel but are critical to literacy learning, such as writing, were regularly ignored. Let me see if I can catch us up here. There we go. Okay. The program was implemented in schools across the United States, including many in Wisconsin. Despite the $6 billion allocated for scripted programs, teacher training, narrowly focused assessments, not to mention the conflict of interest that controlled the types of programs, assessments, and professional development allowed, the results were underwhelming. The final report of the Reading First Impact Study found that despite more time allocated for the 5 essential components of reading instruction, the increased knowledge for teachers in these areas, and more support for struggling readers, Reading First did not produce a statistically significant impact on student reading comprehension test scores in grades 1, 2, or 3. A policy brief issued in 2009 by MDRC, a nonprofit, nonpartisan education and social policy research organization, and one of the subcontractors completing the Reading First study for the Institute of Education Sciences of the United States Department of Education states, and I quote, Reading First's lack of impact on overall reading comprehension test scores may be related to 2 connected issues. First, the type of reading instruction that was promoted by Reading First was already in wide use when the program came online in 2002, in part due to the influence of the National Reading Panel recommendations and an earlier National Research Council report, Preventing Reading Difficulties in Young Children, as well as the availability of funding from the Reading Excellence Act of 1998, the predecessor to Reading First. As a result, the IES studies found that teachers in schools that did not receive Reading First funding, that is, the schools that form the comparison group in the evaluations, also spent the majority of their class time for reading, focusing on the core components of scientifically based reading instruction, recommended by the National Reading Panel and supported by Reading First. Funding for Reading First was eliminated in the fiscal 2009 spending bill. Another study, this one focused on intervention programs, was also mandated under NCLB as part of the 2006 National Assessment of Title I. As you may know, Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act provides financial assistance to local educational agencies and schools with high numbers or high percentages of children from low-income families, with the goal of helping to ensure that all children meet challenging state academic standards. In most cases, especially at that time, Title I money was routinely dedicated to intervention programs in reading and math. The $9 million Power for Kids study was lauded as having the highest possible standards for a research study. The purpose of the study was to find out which of 4 phonics-focused programs designed for struggling readers provided the best results. The study looked at struggling readers in 3rd and 5th grade. The researchers found that students in the treatment group who received instruction from any one of these programs fared no better than students that did not receive the intervention on measures of general reading ability. The executive summary of the study report states, and I quote, "This evidence suggests that the interventions help these students maintain their relative position among all students and not lose ground in reading comprehension," end quote. But the programs did nothing to close the gap with their peers. One of the researchers has been quoted as saying that one of the reasons for the failure of the study was that the interventions did not include enough comprehension instruction. In both of these studies, the results showed that when instruction focused on phonics, students got better at phonics, but that did not impact general reading achievement. These large-scale studies, as well as other less prominent studies and school and district experiences, have proven that an overemphasis on phonics is not the answer to the issues we face in teaching all students to read. One of the assertions of the National Reading Panel that was routinely ignored under NCLB and IDEA was that phonics should not become the dominant component in a reading program, neither in the amount of time devoted to it nor in the significance attached. By emphasizing all of the processes that contribute to growth in reading, teachers will have the best chance of making every child a reader. Experts today largely agree that there needs to be a combination of foundational skills taught in kindergarten through third grade. The July 2016 What Works Clearinghouse Educator's Practice Guide on Foundational Skills to Support Reading for Understanding recommends that reading programs teach students academic language skills, including the use of inferential and narrative language and vocabulary knowledge, develop awareness of the segments of sounds in speech and how they link to letters, also referred to as phonological awareness, teach students to decode words, analyze word parts, and write and recognize words, and ensure that each student reads connected text every day to support reading accuracy, fluency, and comprehension. It should be noted that these recommendations are in addition to those found in the companion guide, Improving Reading Comprehension in Kindergarten through Third Grade, which focuses on reading comprehension in the primary grades. If a greater emphasis on phonics or more fidelity to scripted programs were the answers to the issues we face in teaching all children to read, wouldn't we expect to see phonics as a much larger part of the literacy block in schools that perform well on high-stakes tests? In fact, the opposite is true. Schools that perform well on high-stakes tests tend to focus more on high-level comprehension. It is in the highest need schools where we see the largest focus on phonics. We know that mandating prescriptive programs doesn't work. If the kind of quick fix methods currently being touted really worked, we would not be continuing to see students struggle in our schools. In 2010, the Common Core state standards were released, and those standards, or a variation of them, were adopted by states and districts throughout the U.S. State tests, which are mandated under Title I to be administered to all children in grades 3 through 8 and once in grades 10 through 12, were revised or developed to reflect these standards, and the tests were indexed to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, drastically increasing the expectations for all students. Overnight, we saw a significant decrease in the percentage of students scoring at a proficient or advanced level on state tests, not because the reading abilities of our children decreased, but because the expectations and cut scores changed. P. David Pearson and Elfrida Hebert, two distinguished literacy researchers, summarize the differences between literacy for young children under No Child Left Behind and the current standards. In an article written for Educational Leadership magazine, they argue that we can no longer wait until children have learned to read before we start teaching them how to use reading and writing as tools for learning. We must do both at the same time. Specifically, they state, in the primary grades, the emphasis on simultaneously building foundational skills and introducing complex content is what differentiates a Common Core curriculum from its No Child Left Behind predecessor. NCLB's sharp focus on basic reading skills often resulted in giving short shrift to content areas like social studies and science. In contrast, the Common Core standards support classrooms in which learning to read and reading to learn occur simultaneously and synergistically. The standards demand conceptually rich texts that build skills while engaging students in reading and learning. Common Core primary grade classrooms are characterized by building knowledge, increasing students' responsibility for reading, and providing more time for student involvement with text. What kind of readers do we want to produce? Readers who can decode? That's a given. Without the ability to access the text, students will not become responsible, independent readers. Beyond that, we need our students to develop critical comprehension. Expectations are that students will perform at a proficient or advanced level on the forward exam, and Wisconsin student performance is often compared to students in other states based on performance on the NAEP. However, even students who perform at a basic level on the NAEP or on the state forward exam have the basic decoding ability they need to access the text. What they are generally unable to do is comprehend what they read at an appropriate level of proficiency. The expectations of the basic and proficient performance levels for both of these tests are based on comprehension abilities. Students who are not able to adequately decode the text are more likely to fall into the below basic performance levels. It should be noted that there are multiple other reasons that a student might perform at a below basic level on a one-time test that is intended to provide a snapshot in time of performance, not to be a determining factor in how a child is categorized as a reader, which is too often the case. It is also important to understand that performance on the forward exam is reflective of English language arts performance overall, including not only reading, but how well the student performs on writing as well as listening comprehension, both areas that tend to be ignored or dismissed when a child has difficulty with reading. The importance of writing and its reciprocity with reading is routinely dismissed by some when focusing on phonological issues. In fact, under Reading First, teachers were not allowed to include any work on writing as part of the literacy block. We often hear the term wait to fail used in regards to children who have difficulty learning to read, meaning that we delay intervention for children and wait until about third grade before we consider them to have difficulty with learning to read. While a wait to fail attitude might have been the norm at one time, NCLB and even earlier versions of ESEA allowed for and even encouraged early intervention, which research was already establishing as critical in preventing long-term reading difficulties. When I was hired as a Title I reading teacher in 1987, early intervention or providing support for students as early as first grade was already common, although we have come a long way in what that intervention looks like for students. Another common fallacy we often hear in schools is that we allow students to fall through the cracks, meaning that we fail to notice that some students are having difficulty. In over 35 years as an educator, I have found that to be very rare, and when it does happen, it is generally not because of a flaw in the system or because someone's not noticing. In Wisconsin, there are several laws and recommendations that make it a very rare occurrence for schools to miss identifying a student with needs. Standard C of Wisconsin Statute Chapter 121.02 requires schools and districts to provide interventions or remedial reading services for a pupil in grades kindergarten to 4 if any of the following occurs. The pupil fails to meet the reading objectives specified in the reading curriculum plan. The pupil fails to score above the state minimum performance standard on the reading test, or the pupil's reading assessment indicates that the pupil is at risk of reading difficulty. If this subdivision applies, the interventions or services provided to the pupil shall be scientifically based and shall address all areas in which the pupil is deficient in a manner consistent with the state standards in reading and language arts. I was part of a team that worked during the 1990s to develop a district standard C process and plan for meeting the requirements of the law. That process was routinely updated over time to meet district needs, the findings of relevant research, and district capacity for providing support. Those guidelines were later significantly revised and integrated into the district's multi-level system of support, which was influenced by the 2004 reauthorization of IDEA. A similar process was performed in other schools and districts across the state. In some places, this is referred to as the RTI process. Under the multi-level system of support recommended by the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, virtually every school district has implemented a process to identify and provide support for students who are struggling, beginning at kindergarten or even earlier. However, increasing costs and declining school budgets force our schools and districts to make difficult decisions about where to direct limited funds. Funds for extra instructional support and literacy compete with funds for making sure that all students are safe, funds to provide appropriate class size, and myriad other issues to address equity in our schools. Despite competing needs, it is my experience that most schools and districts work diligently to identify students who are at risk and provide additional support within the time and personnel constraints of the individual school or district. In another attempt to find the answer, the National Early Literacy Panel, or NELP, was convened in 2002 by the National Center for Family Literacy under a grant from the Department of Health and Human Services and the National Institute for Literacy. Their task was to conduct a synthesis of the scientific research on the development of early literacy skills in children ages 0 to 5. It was established for the express purpose of summarizing scientific evidence on early literacy development and on home and family influences on that development. This report identified early literacy skills that predicted later reading performance. These factors tend to indicate the type of home environment the student grew up in, as much as the instruction they may have received in pre-kindergarten or kindergarten. In addition to the items identified as predictive variables, another set of variables more closely related to reading for understanding were also identified. These factors didn't correlate quite as strongly as the first set, in part because they hadn't been as widely evaluated by the researchers. However, any teacher who has sat beside and taught a child to read can attest to the importance of print concepts, oral language, and these others. It should also be noted that just because a variable is predictive of achievement, that does not mean that it should necessarily be assessed or directly taught. For example, in a review of the study, Pearson and Hebert state, the inclusion of rapid automatic naming, or RAN, of all sorts of phenomena on a list of strong predictors is unique to this synthesis. Unlike most of the other strong predictors, letter knowledge, phonemic awareness, writing, and perhaps phonological memory, RAN has not made the transition from early indicator to causally related factor through randomized or even natural experiments. For some reason, in the culture of educational research and development, we seem unable to resist the temptation to believe that predictors are prime candidates to be transformed into causes of learning and achievement. To those who develop curriculum, pedagogy, and professional development, we offer the classic cautionary tale. Don't confuse correlation with causation. There are many factors beyond instruction that influence children's early literacy development, and most of these factors do not disappear once children enter school, and all of them impact student outcomes in our schools. Some of these include attendance. Did the child attend pre-kindergarten? How often is he or she absent and/or tardy? Engagement and health issues can significantly impact how a student attends to instruction. Homelessness, where did the child sleep last night, or did he? Hunger, has the child had anything to eat since yesterday's school lunch? What did he or she eat over the weekend? Parental support, do parents openly support the school and their child's learning, or do they refuse the services that are offered? What did the child do when school was out for 10 to 12 weeks during the summer? Did any of their activities include opportunities to practice what they had learned during the previous grade? Transiency, or how often does the child move to different schools, either within or between districts? Trauma, does the child spend time hiding from or being the victim of physical, verbal, or psychological abuse outside of school? Have you ever been in a classroom that needs to be vacated by all the other students because a young child of 4, 5, 6, or 7 is so distraught that he is throwing desks and chairs across the room? Teacher expertise and teacher churning, or teachers moving between schools and districts, all of these things impact how our students do. I don't believe any of these issues have been factored into models of struggling readers, but all of them have an impact on children's lives and on their achievement in school, and so compete for teacher time and attention. Wisconsin schools have seen sharp increases in levels of poverty over the last decade, and poverty tends to bring increases in many of the factors just described that impact student outcomes, but which the schools have little, if any, control over. Educators continue to adjust to the changing needs. The use of research in education is vitally important. It is also important to understand the research from a variety of perspectives and evaluate it critically. For example, we know that strong research supports systematic phonics instruction, but there is no research that supports the narrow, decontextualized approach that is routinely advocated. Instruction in phonics needs to be part of a broader curriculum that includes reading for meaning. We also know that what qualifies as scientific research, that is experimental and quasi-experimental studies, cannot tell us everything we need to know about something as complex as teaching all children to read. I am not a researcher, I don't work at a university, but I have been trained to be a critical consumer of research. I know that there are a variety of kinds of research, that all of them contribute to our understandings in different but significant ways. I also know that all research comes with limitations and that some research adds significantly to our knowledge base, but that much of it doesn't. Dr. Nell Duke, distinguished literacy researcher, and her colleague Nicole Martin, in their 2011 article, 10 Things Every Literacy Educator Should Know About Research, remind us that the educational enterprise is far too complex for one type of research to answer all of our questions or meet all of our needs. As a critical consumer, I also know the difference between research, opinion, anecdotes, and testimonials. In his 2016 book, Weaponized Lies, How to Think Critically in the Post-Truth Era, Dr. Daniel Levitin, neuroscientist and cognitive psychologist, cautions that journalists sometimes forget that the plural of anecdote is not data. That is, a bunch of stories or casual observations do not make science. This contention is important for us as educators as well. In conversations about dyslexia, I often hear from advocates that if only we had taught more phonics or more phonological awareness or taught it in a different way, we wouldn't have students who struggle. If we would just provide a certain type of intervention for the child, or a specific brand name intervention, or a brand name phonics program in our classrooms, we would eliminate most of the literacy issues in our schools. I, as well as other literacy professionals I know, have routinely asked for the evidence to support these contentions. If we receive anything in response to these requests, it usually consists of opinion pieces posted on blogs or websites, personal testimonials, descriptions of programs, or self-reported research. Most of these sources include few, if any, references, much less rigorous scientific evidence. Rarely have I received actual research that supports the position being advocated. As a reading specialist who is expected to provide expert advice to district administrators as required under state law, it would be unethical of me to rely on this sort of information. Reading First and other studies such as those described earlier have further shown us that focusing too narrowly on certain types of research can be a waste of federal, state, and local taxpayer dollars. One of the reasons that researchers disagree is that they see things from different perspectives and understand things in different ways based on the definitions and theories they use in designing their studies. There are many theories and models of reading, and each one looks at things from a slightly different perspective. There are a number of texts that describe different theories, such as the Theoretical Models and Processes of Reading, now in its 6th edition. Its 1,300 pages, as well as numerous other professional texts, show us that there are many different viewpoints and lots of information to consider when teaching children to read. While all of them can inform our thinking and provide some guidance about what we know or what is possible, there is no way to say that one model holds all the answers or is totally right for every child and others are totally wrong. We need to be looking for converging evidence from multiple sources and then examining how the findings, often coming from tightly controlled clinical settings, can be adapted to the far less controlled environment of the classroom or the school. Yet, in conversations about dyslexia, my experience is that any research that does not comport with beliefs is routinely belittled and dismissed, regardless of the strength of that research. I and my colleagues am disturbed by the gross misrepresentation this morning of one such example, reading recovery. Reading recovery is an intervention targeted to first grade students who are the lowest in their grade. It is delivered to students through a 12 to 20 week series of individual, daily, 30-minute lessons provided by a reading recovery trained teacher. The overarching goal of the program is to intervene early before young students' reading difficulties become lifelong obstacles. It is repeatedly dismissed and even vilified by dyslexia advocates. In fact, it has been called dangerous for students, despite extensive evidence of its effectiveness. Most of the critiques of reading recovery that I've seen show a lack of study and understanding of what reading recovery is. The What Works Clearinghouse, a part of the Institute of Educational Sciences, and generally considered to be the #1 resource for information to be used in making evidence-based decisions, accepted several studies of reading recovery with strong evidence of effectiveness as early as 2007. Reading recovery is also listed as effective on the National Center for Intensive Intervention. Based in part on the strength of that evidence, in 2010, Reading Recovery received a $45 million Investing in Innovation, or I3 grant, from the U.S. Department of Education, which added considerable additional evidence to the research base. That study, which included nearly 7,000 students and which was evaluated by the Independent Consortium for Policy Research and Education, has also met the What Works Clearinghouse standards of evidence. Additionally, there is no credible evidence that it has caused harm to any student, dyslexic or otherwise. In fact, reading recovery is a clear example of an intervention that can be used to help determine whether a child's reading difficulties are likely to require long-term intervention. Evidence shows that the typical reading recovery student enters first grade reading at a beginning kindergarten level, and many of them catch up to their grade level peers within the 12 to 20 weeks allocated for the intervention. What makes reading recovery different from those programs commonly promoted but which have little or no corroborating research is that there is no program or kit that can be purchased, and no one profits financially from the intervention. Rather, it relies on expert teachers who have a deep knowledge base in literacy and are responsive to the needs of the individual child. Those teachers receive a year of graduate level coursework while working directly with the most difficult to teach children. The learning extends beyond that first year, continuing as long as the teacher works as a reading recovery instructor. In addition to the deep knowledge base in early literacy learning, which includes significant work in how to teach phonemic awareness and phonics, reading recovery teachers are part of an ongoing professional development network that includes university trainers, teacher leaders, and other reading recovery teachers. They engage in deep study and problem solving around the hardest to teach students. As a professional, I find it disconcerting to be told that this type of learning is irrelevant or inferior to spending a few days learning about phonics from someone who is anxious to sell a product. As educators, we need to make tough decisions every single day. These are not hypothetical issues. They are real decisions that need to be made. Do we take the limited amount of time available to us for intervention and spread it among as many students as possible, providing only a small amount of time for each one and averaging it among a group of students? Or do we provide the amount of time that will truly make a difference for an individual child and only provide support for a few students? Do we focus on the students who are almost there, those who are just below the benchmark on the high-stake test, or the test we use to determine how they will do on the high-stakes test? Or do we work with those that have the largest gaps? What happens when a child arrives at the school as a third grader, for example, shows no signs of an intellectual disability, and doesn't yet know the alphabet? When that child gets to 5th grade, the performance on the forward exam will become a part of the school's quality rating. We have just over a year to make up for over 3 years of little or no effective instruction. Do we squeeze him into an already overbooked schedule with a reading teacher or specialist? Drop a student whose needs are not as great, or have him wait till there's an opening in the schedule? Do we focus our efforts each year on students who are new to the school and based on enrollment history are likely to be gone again within a year? It is not uncommon for a student to move into a school in 1st grade already having attended 3, 4, or even 5 previous schools. How do you help that child make up for all the lost time? What if a child has been diagnosed with dyslexia? Do that child's needs merit support regardless of the needs of the other students, even if their needs are not as severe? What are the side effects of mislabeling a child as dyslexic or as a child with any kind of disability? What is the difference between a child who is dyslexic and one who struggles for other reasons? What is the benefit to any child of having a label? What benefit is there for a child who defines him or herself by that label, who comes to school and says, I have dyslexia, I can't do that, or I don't have to do that, I have dyslexia? What are the costs involved in providing the support students need, and where will those funds come from? What do we stop doing to find that funding? Do we hire high-quality, knowledgeable reading teachers or reading specialists to work with our most struggling readers, or paraprofessionals with no teaching background and minimal training and give them a kit or script with little or no evidence of effectiveness? How much time can any child afford away from the classroom environment? When is the best time to pull that child away to give them the extra support they need? Do we pull the student from art, music, or Phi Ed, which might be the only place where that child regularly feels successful? Do we pull them from math, science, or social studies, which develop important concepts, vocabulary, and background knowledge, critical for comprehension and the learning of future subjects, and which have a profound impact on critical comprehension as assessed on state and national tests? Does the support they receive offset what they are missing? As I stated earlier, these are not hypothetical situations. They are ethical and moral decisions that are made every day in our schools. In my experience, we don't choose not to provide support for a child within the regular education setting. Rather, we have to choose which child needs the support the most, what level of support they need, and what is the best support for each individual, given the constraints of staffing and time. There are no simple answers to these complex issues, just as there are no simple answers to the complex process of learning to read. Restrictive regulations, especially those based on limited, faulty, or unproven research, will help few, if any, students and will be detrimental to many. Schools already live under well-meaning legislation that has not been helpful to students. Wisconsin State Statute Chapter 118.016, first enacted in 2011 and later modified, requires schools to provide screening and intervention for students beginning in 4-year-old kindergarten. This law came out of the Governor's Read to Lead task force to ensure, in part, that we are not missing or failing to notice struggling students. Originally, a state-level assessment was mandated for all students in pre-kindergarten through grade 2. That was later amended to allow districts to choose the assessment as long as it meets certain parameters. Some will tell you that the law is not prescriptive enough, that there are other factors that must be included. Changing this law to include additional factors will not ensure that we do a better job of identifying students who are at risk. Experience and evidence tell me that is not the case. We have the information we need to identify our students most at risk. We have the level of expertise needed to address those. We don't always have the capacity in terms of time and personnel to meet all of those needs. Just what is dyslexia? There are a number of definitions available. And which one do we choose? Which is the right definition, the most accurate? The International Dyslexia Association, which began in the 1920s as the Orton Society and later changed its name to the Orton Dyslexia Society, adopted its definition in 2002. It states that dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities, and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. According to the National Institute for Health, dyslexia is a brain-based type of learning disability that specifically impairs a person's ability to read. These individuals typically read at levels significantly lower than expected despite having normal intelligence. Although the disorder varies from person to person, common characteristics among people with dyslexia are difficulty with phonological processing or the manipulation of sounds, spelling, and/or rapid visual verbal responding. Dyslexia can be inherited in some families, and recent studies have identified a number of genes that may predispose an individual to developing dyslexia. There are also a number of other definitions, including ones from the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Mayo Clinic, not to mention the differences among the various dyslexia research centers, including the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity, the University of Michigan, and the Florida Center for Reading Research. While there tend to be similarities, some of the definitions are quite narrow, while others use broad terms, such broad terms that they encompass virtually all students with reading difficulties. The American Psychiatric Association took on this issue when it published the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-5, in 2013. The DSM-5 is the handbook used by healthcare professionals in the United States and much of the world as the authoritative guide for diagnosis and research purposes. Their expert consensus was to include classification criteria for a specific learning disorder in the DSM-5. Dyslexia is listed as an alternative term within the category of specific learning disorder and refers to a pattern of learning difficulties characterized by problems with accurate or fluent word recognition, poor decoding, and poor spelling abilities. The DSM-5 Neurodevelopmental Work Group concluded that the many definitions of dyslexia and dyscalculia meant those terms would not be useful as disorder names or in the diagnostic criteria. Not only is there no agreed upon definition, but different evaluators use different instruments to diagnose dyslexia. Who has the right combination? What we do know is that there is no widely agreed on definition, no one right assessment tool, and no one right instructional tool. What experts do seem to agree on is that dyslexic students differ, their needs differ. For example, the University of Michigan's Dyslexia Help website states, developmental dyslexia is a multifaceted, interesting phenomena. Let's say that while there are many commonalities, each dyslexic has his or her own individual profile that needs to be discovered and understood, and then an appropriate plan of action can be developed. Marianne Wolf, in her book Proust and the Squid, states, there are no universally effective programs, but there are knowable principles that need to be incorporated in all programs about how we teach written language. And reading experts Karen Wixon, Marjorie Lipson, and Peter Johnston tell us, classroom teachers and specialists often feel pressured to adopt specialized programs for struggling students, and issues of program and approach are hotly debated in many schools, sometimes limiting collaborative efforts. Studies that shed light on what instruction and which measures suggest that there is not one approach that is essential for accelerating students' reading achievement. Indeed, there is evidence that differing approaches can be equally successful as long as there is expert teaching and careful attention to student progress. Dyslexia, however you define it, occurs along a continuum just like every other reading difficulty. Students who have been labeled dyslexia by outside agencies are not necessarily those who are the neediest, and I have never seen a diagnosis that comes with a qualifier that says the condition is mild or moderate or severe or profound. What we in the schools tend to get is a label and a standard prescription, and the prescription is generally for a program or approach with little or no specific scientific evidence of effectiveness. What's the difference between a child with dyslexia and a child who struggles with reading for other reasons? Or are all kids who struggle with reading dyslexic? Regardless of the answer, each child is different and needs specialized attention. A policy statement by the American Academy of Pediatrics states that learning disabilities are complex problems that require complex solutions. There is simply no one program or approach that will meet the diverse needs of students. As an educator, I often wonder about the benefit of a label, especially one that does not have a common definition or even consensus in how it is identified. Some will tell you that classroom teachers, reading specialists just don't know about or recognize students with dyslexia. That is simply not true. What is true is that we are more focused on finding the right instructional plan to meet the needs of a student rather than putting a label on a student, especially when we have little or no information about where a diagnosis was made, who made it, or how it was determined. A label tells us little or nothing about what a child needs to learn or about which instructional techniques will work best for that individual. The only way to know that is through diagnostic assessment and instructional expertise. We care about teaching the child sitting next to us at that particular moment, not the hypothetical child that fits an imagined perfect model. As a professional reading specialist, I don't need a label or another test to determine if a student has difficulty with reading or how to address that difficulty. What I and my colleagues need is time to administer appropriate diagnostic assessments, time to reflect upon what those assessments tell us about a student's strengths and needs, and the freedom to use my expertise to meet that student's unique individual needs. However, we do need more reading teachers and reading specialists to do this. In the schools, we commonly hear from dyslexia advocates that what we are doing, how we are teaching is wrong. Yet their descriptions of what is supposedly happening are far different than what we actually see in schools. Stories of waiting for students to fail, watching students fall through the cracks are common, as are stories of schools where phonics is not taught or where students are taught to randomly guess at words. These are stories, anecdotes, and perceptions that are rarely supported by evidence. Statements that do come from research are often decontextualized to purposely lead to an erroneous conclusion. Recommendations for addressing these perceived issues commonly include prescriptive programs with little or no high-quality evidence of effectiveness, but often firmly tied to ideology. As a district-level reading specialist, I know that reading intervention is big business. I am bombarded with emails, phone calls, catalogs, and other communications from vendors who have something to sell. They all have the answer for our students who struggle, but little, if any, of it comes with convincing evidence of effectiveness. The only pathway that has consistently proven effective is teacher expertise. In their book, Professional Capital, Andy Hargraves and Michael Fullen, whose work has been instrumental in the transformation of the Canadian education system, remind us that the essence of professionalism is the ability to make discretionary judgments. If a teacher always has to consult a teacher's manual or follow the lesson line by line in a script, you know that teacher is not a professional, either because he or she doesn't know how to judge or isn't being allowed to. In discussing interventions for students at risk of reading difficulties, Elliott and Grigorenko cite researchers Vaughn and Roberts, noting that while the precise balance of activities needs to be tailored to the particular strengths and weaknesses of the student, key elements of literacy instruction are as follows: phonemic awareness, phonics, spelling and writing, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. No program can replace an expert teacher that can respond to the unique individual needs of the student. In the Reading Recovery I3 study described earlier, one of the questions explored was regarding instructional strength. Why was the intervention, as with all interventions, more successful in some places than in others? The researchers concluded that two critical factors were deliberateness, or an encompassing commitment to thoughtful practice, and instructional dexterity, which they defined as the flexible application of deep skill. Experience and evidence convinced me that these factors apply beyond the reading recovery tutoring situation. Our schools and teachers do need to continue to grow and learn and develop even greater professional capacity. That will not happen with restrictive laws that limit the knowledge available or prescriptive programs that prevent teachers from using professional judgment. That will not happen with a continued obsession with test scores that overtly or covertly encourage teachers to teach to the test rather than to teach the child. In our schools, professional development in literacy competes with professional development in math, science, culturally responsive education, trauma-informed care, and other new and continuing needs. Our limited time and professional development funds must go towards what has been proven effective, not materials and methods that have repeatedly failed to demonstrate effectiveness. If the work of schooling were straightforward, its organization simple, and the proposed changes discrete, the mechanical implementation of fixed changes would be quite sensible. Practitioners would just need to follow the directions and the desired outcomes should ensue. But this is not the reality of contemporary schooling. The tasks we seek to improve, as well as the organization in which they are embedded, are quite complex. Often this is true as well for the solutions that are being introduced. Absent an appreciation for this complexity, many efforts to change schools just add to their dysfunction. These words by Anthony Brick, president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and his colleagues, researchers in the area of school improvement science, remind us that we must consider the complexity of the improvements we are striving to make. If we fail to do so, we may find ourselves adding to the challenges that our schools face. It is easy for those who spend their time outside of schools in the K-12 education system to say, well, if you just did this or did it this way. The complexities of school life are many. Every new initiative, every new mandate means less time for something else. Every time funding is reduced, something is lost. Often that means time for literacy. I know that my words will be lauded by some, scoffed at or dismissed by others, and declared inaccurate or distorted by still others. However, I felt it was important to speak to this committee because the recommendations made will potentially affect every one of the over 850,000 students who attend public schools in the state of Wisconsin for years to come. In an opinion piece published earlier this spring in the Huffington Post, Dr. Julian Elliott, professor of educational psychology, dyslexia expert, and the author of the book, The Dyslexia Debate, exhorts us not to make the same mistakes they made in the UK. In part, he says, emerging policy and legislation in the U.S., which is seemingly geared toward helping poor readers improve their skills, often ends up instead serving the needs of a burgeoning dyslexia treatment industry. This means the needs of some children are prioritized, while those of others are massively subverted. And in my experience, the children who lose out are often those whose life chances are already reduced by socioeconomic disadvantage. Does dyslexia exist? Of course it does. There are students who have significant difficulty learning to read because of phonological deficits. That is not at issue. There are genetic studies and neurological evidence for such a construct. What is at issue is the fact that there is no evidence to support restrictive laws that limit teacher expertise in professional decision-making in favor of one-size-fits-all scripted programs that run contrary to the premise of professional decision-making, a concept that is also emphasized in teacher evaluation systems. There is no evidence to support specific tests and materials that must be used, or more tests that don't tell us what we need to know or that tell us what we already know. What is needed? We could use more funding to hire or train additional reading teachers and reading specialists in our schools, and incentives to encourage teachers to take on the challenge of becoming that expert. We could use more funding for ongoing professional development, but not for product training. It is important that those funds wouldn't restrict how or what can be learned. If legislation about dyslexia was the answer to address children who struggle, then Texas would be at the top of the performance levels on the NAEP, the literacy test that compares states, and Massachusetts would be at the bottom. But the reverse is true. In fact, Texas, which has one of the oldest and one of the more prescriptive dyslexia laws, is very close to the bottom of the rankings, and Massachusetts, which has no laws related specifically to dyslexia, has long been at the top. Some will scoff at what I've presented and say there is no debate, that this is settled science, but the truth is that researchers and scientists don't agree. In the foreword to Julian Elliott and Elena Grigorenko's book, The Dyslexia Debate, distinguished researcher and professor of psychology, Dr. Frank Valentino says, The reader who is unfamiliar with the relevant literature will be immediately struck by the utter lack of consensus regarding whether dyslexia is little more than a descriptive and somewhat misleading label for early reading difficulties or a neuropsychological construct with well-established construct validity. To see all sides of this issue, I recommend this book. Noted educational researcher Yang Zhao, in a 2017 article, What Works May Hurt, Side Effects in Education, which was written for the Journal of Educational Change, states, education as a field has been slow to improve because it has largely failed to build on past experiences. One way to build on past experiences is to consider side effects as an integral aspect of research. Given the complexity of this issue, the hundreds of thousands of Wisconsin students that will potentially be impacted, and the redirection of resources likely to occur as a result of legislation created by the study committee, it is critical that this committee seriously contemplate and be mindful of the significant implications, including the negative side effects that could result from any proposed legislation. Past experience and research have shown us that the most important aspects for student success are the expertise and professional decision-making of the teacher. Thank you for your time.
All right, well, thank you. Well, I just wanted to kind of follow up that some points you touched on at the end in terms of what do you need, what would help address the needs of students that are struggling to read. And you mentioned specifically funding for more teachers or somehow addressing the teacher issue. Before, you'd also mentioned you needed time and freedom. I'm just wondering if there's other things legislatively too that could address those issues, or is it really just the teacher shortage you think is the main issue?
I really think it has a lot to do with the teacher shortage and the fact that teachers don't feel respected for their expertise, for their knowledge. I can speak for myself more than anyone else, but it's very disconcerting to be told I don't know what I'm talking about, or that I should go to someone with much less knowledge and expertise than me to be trained on how to teach reading. And those kinds of things happen regularly in our schools. And that is not to dismiss, please understand me, I am not dismissing the plight of students who struggle, students who have dyslexia. We know that's an issue. But it's very difficult to be told that we're ignoring them because they have dyslexia. That would simply not be true. I don't, did that?
So I want to ask this question step away from the classroom and the individual teacher for a moment and look kind of at a higher, more kind of global level. You listed a lot of things that affect education and educational outcomes, and all of them do, poverty and trauma and all that stuff. But every other state in the country experiences those too. They've experienced the rise in many of those things the same way we have in Wisconsin, as poverty and free lunch went up in Wisconsin and went up nationwide. And for the last 20 years, Wisconsin has steadily lost its footing compared to other states for fourth grade reading. And the evidence seems to say that the states that are moving ahead of us, Massachusetts, Florida, others, are doing it by embracing a particular body of science. Do you have a different explanation for why it is that we've fallen from 3rd to 34th and every subgroup in Wisconsin reads below the average for that subgroup nationwide?
I will say that that is not an area that I have spent a lot of time worrying about. I worry more about the kids sitting next to me, or the kids, I shouldn't say sitting next to me, but the students that we work with on a regular basis, and how can we best provide for their needs. I know that as we have continued to try and improve our programs, we run up against increasing issues all the time. We continue to adjust and make changes. I am not by any means against understanding a particular body of research. I think there are some important things there. I get very upset when people tell us because of anecdotes that those things aren't happening in the schools. I would say, schools are like anywhere else. We have great places, we have places where things are working really well, and we have places where there is need for improvement. But to make broad statements and say everybody's doing it wrong because overall their kids aren't where they need to be would be inappropriate as well. Earlier, some people talked about let's take a look at where things are happening effectively. I mean, I know that we do that in our own district. We know that where things are happening appropriately, kids are growing. Where they're not, there's room for improvement, and we continue to work on that. I don't think you can legislate that, though. I believe that that has to be done on a case-by-case basis with expert people who know what they're looking for and who have the time and ability to provide the support for the teachers and the individuals who need that training.
Rebecca, thank you, first of all, early in your presentation for the, pardon?
It's Deb.
Deb? Deborah or Debbie? Or Deb, okay. Yeah. For your summary of our long history of trying to provide service to children that are struggling in reading. It's something that I've followed along with you over the years. You made a statement that I was wondering if you could expound on that just a little bit. You said learning to read and reading to learn. Could you explain that a little bit?
Traditionally, there's been an idea that from kindergarten to about second grade, we teach children how to read, and then they read to learn. So they learn to read, then read to learn. What we know is we can't put off reading to learn until kids have learned to read, that we need to teach both at the same time. So kids need to have experiences, and they need to learn about those foundational skills, but having those foundational skills doesn't automatically imply that they will understand what they read. So we have to be teaching them how to make sense, how to interpret and understand the texts that they're reading at the same time that we are teaching them how to read. That's often done more through read-alouds and discussion, so that kids are understanding how to think about it, how to think about text at the same time they're learning how to actually access or decode the text.
Do you think that the second part, reading to learn, do you think that helps improve reading?
Yes, but it's not enough. I don't want to think that just practicing reading is all you need to do to learn, to get better at it, but it certainly helps. I mean, there's no question that if you don't read, your reading will not improve. But for some kids especially, there needs to be additional instruction as well. And I think that was mentioned earlier by some people as well, that there are some kids who even in 4th, 5th, and 5th grade and beyond, they still need instruction in the how to read while they are reading to learn.
Nancy Drussel, and then I'll have, or were you done, Michael?
Yes, I'm done,
Okay.
thank you.
Yep. And then I'll have the final question, and then we'll move on to the next.
You spoke quite a bit about reading recovery. How many reading recovery trained teachers are there in the state of Wisconsin? How many schools are able to offer?
I honestly could not answer that question. I don't know.
And has there been any research done on that particular intervention with students who have been identified with dyslexia?
I don't know of any that's been where they're specifically already identified. Part of that is because it's generally implemented before students are identified. Mm-hmm. We have found, like I said, in my experience with it, it is that great first intervention to see, and the idea is if you're sitting one-on-one for 30 minutes a day with an expert teacher who can respond to your needs, and like I said, there is a structure to reading recovery, but it doesn't say it doesn't tell you this is what you do with that child. You have to be able to know that child and adjust your instruction to that child. And if a child goes through 20 weeks of that kind of intensive intervention and is still struggling, that usually tells us they're going to need a lot more. And whether that is, what area exactly that is, it's going to depend again on the needs of that child. I do have to say, though, like I said, I think that was misrepresented earlier. And I've had a lot of people come who say, I've been trained in reading recovery, and they haven't been. They've been trained by somebody who says it's kind of like reading recovery or who uses some of the text. But reading recovery is a very intensive training program, and it's ongoing.
Thank you. You also made the comment that typically the students with dyslexia are not necessarily the students with the greatest needs. How are the students with dyslexia typically supported in the schools that you've worked in?
By an expert teacher who can diagnose the needs of that child and address their needs as the child needs to have them addressed. And if the child's weaknesses are in phonological area and their strengths are in using meaning, then we're going to use that strength to help develop that phonological weakness. So it really is dependent on the child. I guess, we've been accused, some of us in the schools, me personally, of not believing in dyslexia or not using the term. It's not about that. It's about what does this child sitting right here need, and how can I best provide that? And that's really what good instruction is all about.
And then my last question, do you have any personal experience with someone with a neurological disorder such as dyslexia or ADHD or
Personal, as you mean within my family?
family or close friends
Close
outside of the
friends,
school
definitely.
setting?
I have close friends who've had that, yes.
And I had asked the other presenters what legislation would look like. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me like you were saying that we shouldn't do anything? Is that what I'm hearing you say? Or what would legislation outside of additional funds, which you indicated, and I can certainly understand the why and applaud that, but what would legislation look like in your mind for this topic? Or is it status quo ante is good?
My concern is that we have a lot of legislation, and that legislation is not necessarily being enforced or being supported. And I'm not saying that it could, I'm not saying that when I say it's not being supported, I'm saying we don't have the time and funding to carry it out the way it's been designed. For example, Standard C has been on the books for many, many years. I don't even know when it was implemented. And it requires us to do the kind of intervention, that we're talking about. The problem is schools aren't necessarily provided funding for that. I know in the district that I work, fully half of the funding at our elementary for interventions with students comes through Title I. Every year we worry how much are our Title I funds going to be cut, and how will we deal with that, because it's going to provide less intervention. I can't say that I've really thought about what I would want legislation to look like. All I know is that the more restrictive it is, the less likely it is to help in general. And if it doesn't come with funding, it just means something else has to give to find the time for it.
Thank you very much for coming in. I appreciate your testimony. Thank you. We have the final person of the day, Mark Seidenberg from the Vilas Research. And he has been very, very, very patient, and I greatly appreciate that, Mark. I think you were potentially under the inclination that you were going to be on this morning. I don't know how wires got crossed there.
I'm afraid it's a long day for everyone.
But you have a lot to say, and we intend to give you that space. So everyone else has had about an hour and 10 minutes, but Legislative Counsel whispered in my ear and said, this gentleman has been patient and waiting, don't cut him off. So at some point I will, but it won't be, I think, before you are done. And so thank you for your patience and your time.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Let me just say a word about who I am. I'm University of Wisconsin-Madison professor. I'm in the psychology department. I studied reading, language, child development, many of the things we've been hearing about today. Those are my areas of research. I've been involved in research on dyslexia for many years, In the old days, it was all behavioral research where we would sit with the children and evaluate them using, by interacting with them in various ways. Now we have brain imaging and other things, and I do that kind of research as well. I've been a Madison resident for 17 years. Thank you. I have 2 children who are educated at Madison Public Schools. Our daughter just graduated from the University of Wisconsin at Madison and has a job. I've taught courses on the science of reading, which is what I do, and its relevance to education at UW since I got here in 2001. It is in the psychology department, and it usually gets students who are from psychology and community of disorders and sciences, and it very rarely gets students who are in education. I also wrote a book on reading for a general audience, and the purpose of that book was to summarize some of the, I have a copy of the book somewhere. It was to summarize the science and then try to ask if this science is so good. And we've learned so much about reading in research that's been done in Wisconsin and in the United States and in labs around the country and in various languages and writing systems, and we've converged on a huge body of information about how kids learn to read and the kinds of struggles that they encounter and the kinds of things that need to be done to help them to promote skilled reading. If the science is so good, how come there's so many poor readers? And why aren't we doing better? And so one of the main points of that book is that the science and educational practices are pretty disconnected, and that's harmful. There's a lot of really good research, important research that's left on the table. And there's a lot of defensiveness about research, which I think we heard in the previous talk. And really, it's been very hard to build bridges because, you know, it's kind of an example of the polarization over important issues that's happened in this country in lots of different ways. You get groups that talk to each other and are very reinforcing of their beliefs, and the opportunities for people to cross those boundaries are very limited. This is a problem. So I tried to address that in this book. And okay, so what can I do for you? Certainly I want to endorse the goals of the committee, because I do think we could be doing better, and that to fail to do better is really harmful for the state, and ultimately, as this is playing out in other states, it's harmful for the country. I have consulted with or given presentations for departments of public instruction, departments of education in several states: Colorado, Pennsylvania, Utah, Mississippi, where there's other groups like this that are interested in figuring out what they can do about their literacy problems. So I'm here for you. What I thought I would do is spare you the PowerPoints and maybe address a couple of basic issues, and then try to clarify things, because you've heard today, you know, why there is debate and why it's hard to make progress. And if I can provide some background on those kinds of issues, you know, that's something I'd be really happy to do. I have a basic view, which is that we should be doing better than we are. Of course, reading problems arise from for many reasons. A lot of them arise outside of the school. They are due to societal and cultural factors. They're due to income differences. They're due to many, many other things that are not, you know, that show up in the classroom, but are not caused by the classroom. And my attitude about that is that while we're working on other problems like nutrition and access to health care and poverty, we still have lots of children to educate. And that makes it even more important to do the best job we possibly can with those kids, because they're going to get less help from outside the school, outside their home. And so, you know, without downplaying it in any way, how important those other issues are and their impact, it makes me want to do the best we possibly can with things that are more malleable, like doing the best job we can, boosting kids' chances for success, even if we haven't solved poverty yet. So I think that Ms. Warren, a few hours ago, really had her finger on what the issues are, basically. One is, you have to prevent, we need to be doing preventive medicine. I don't want to say preventive education. We need to do preventive medicine kind of thing here where dyslexia is headed off before it gets bad and the problems cascade. That means doing things with kids who are young, because as the child gets older and they've fallen behind and they're doing poorly, and you know, being a poor reader is a really visible thing, people can tell, you get kids opting out, and it becomes harder and harder to reach them. And so, you know, we want to head these things off at the pass. That's why so much of the discussion is focused on very young kids, before they get to school, when they get to school, for several years of school and beyond. I think so. There's the screening issue is part of it. Yes, you want to be able to screen. You want to see who is at risk for continuing reading problems. Can you diagnose who is dyslexic when they're 5 years old? No. No. Can you definitively tell which first graders are going to go on to become good readers and which first graders are on the path to really struggling for a very long time because they have this constitutional problem that's making it very hard? No. The reason that you do a screening is because you're dealing, you have two problems. One, you need to identify the kids who are at risk for problems really young. Two, they're really young. They're little children. There's not that much you can do with them. And even though I do brain research, and I think it is progressing quite a lot, it is not the case that we could just put these kids in an MRI scanner, look at their brains and say, oh, that one's going to have dyslexia and that one's not. The research is not at that point yet. So the problem is to identify kids who are at risk. They're at risk. And there's a number of risk factors. You know, their socioeconomic status is one, the education level of their parents is one, whether there have been reading problems or literacy problems in the family is one. Coming from going to a weak school, or one with poor personnel, or one of the poorer school, that's a risk factor. But what we really want to find out is, you know, have the kids develop the kind of foundations on which literacy is built, and before they fall off the cliff of struggling reading. And the best that we can do is like cast a net. That's what these screeners are for. Hopefully they'll be relatively quick and reliable, and they will pull in children who really should be performing better on these tasks, which are things like naming letters or telling if words rhyme and doing a couple of other things. It'll pull in these kids who really are already behind. You know, children who are behind in reading are behind on the first day of kindergarten. They're behind in the pre-reading skills like knowledge of letters and knowledge of the simple sounds associated with them. They're behind on things like vocabulary. Their language skills are not as good. So, you know, there are children who are behind by the time they show up at school. And so the point of the screener is to say, who's going to need more attention? Now, it's a given that we cannot definitively tell who's dyslexic and who's not, because you know what? Dyslexia develops. It develops. It's something that emerges over time. There's like a famous researcher who was asked, like, you know, who said something like, all babies are dyslexic. Everyone is born dyslexic, because no one can read when they're born. You're dyslexic for this first, you're alexic, we would say. But anyway, you can't read until you begin reading. And what we're trying to do is find out who is going to be on the path to success and who's going to need more intervention. And the screeners will pull in kids who would be okay even if you left them alone, because some will. And it will pull in kids who really do need more help. So there's this period when the kids are developing it's kind of a window where it's uncertain. I wish I had one slide which showed you kids who are going to become good readers, they don't learn to read at the same rate. And so you find some kids who are hares and who get off to a really fast start, and they're the ones who are reading Harry Potter in first grade. You get other kids who are going to be good readers who are on a much slower trajectory. It takes them to grade 2, grade 3, and they don't really get off the ground as fast. Well, during the ages 4 to 7 or so, there's a window where some of those kids who are on the slower trajectory but going to be okay, their behavior looks a lot like kids who are really in trouble because they have this constitutional problem that's interfering with reading. That's why you have to do screening. You can't definitively tell those kids apart for a while. You can't just wait until they separate because then it'll be too late. What's the harm in the screening? The screening will pull in some kids who would have been okay with just continuing the experience they were already having. But if the worst that will happen for those kids is that they could get directed to some extra reading time, some extra intervention that will do them zero harm, and let them go back into the normal stream, the regular stream. It's not going to harm anybody if they accidentally get pulled in by this net, but it's going to harm people if they're not identified and they don't get the interventions early, because their problems are going to cascade very, very rapidly if they don't catch up early. I think the thing that so the screening was one part of it, and the other part that you raised was, well, okay, you screen the kids, then what? And the point there is that you have to have people with relevant sorts of skills to be able to deal with the children who are at risk. Now, the previous speaker's attitude is very common. It says, teachers know how to teach. The best thing that we have is our experience. We've been doing this for years. We know what works, and just leave us alone and we will be able to handle this. Well, with all due respect to the effort and to the successes that often people have, I have a problem with that. Because I think that you can't learn everything about reading from just watching kids. First of all, they're in a complicated situation in which lots of different things are going on in a classroom. Second of all, just looking at what the kid who's sitting next to you is doing is not actually a systematic form of evidence or data. You need to evaluate the kid in a much more systematic way. Otherwise, you're just following your pre-existing beliefs about what's important. So we actually think people need training, and training that's up to date, which includes things like, what is dyslexia? What are the questions about dyslexia? How can you identify dyslexics? What makes a dyslexic differ from a non-dyslexic who's also poor reader? Do dyslexics vary a great deal? How do the characteristics of dyslexia change over time? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that information is not part of teacher education in Wisconsin routinely and in the rest of the country. I know this because I work with people in other states, and I work with other officials who are trying to change the way teachers are educated. Most of America recognizes that there is a problem with the way that teachers are educated. You may think that your child's teacher has been taught them how to teach them to read. They haven't. Teachers are left to learn on the job with support from other teachers who are learning on the job. Learning on the job is a very tough proposition. It's discovery learning. There's a philosophy that says the best way to learn something is discover it rather than be told it. That's an approach to teaching children. John Dewey, people like that. Well, the same attitude applies to teaching teachers. It's discovery learning. It's learning on the job. That makes the kids the subjects in a little experiment that the teacher is engaged in. And, it makes it hard on the teacher. It's a really tough thing to try to learn what's effective about teaching kids to read while you're trying to teach kids to read and do all the other things a teacher has to do, of course. Somebody said that, 80% of the kids will be okay regardless of what happens in the classroom. That's not quite right. It might be 80% of the kids who are from middle-class white backgrounds, who have other resources in the home and in the community. For a lot of those kids who have a lot of resources and other things going for them, what happens in the classroom, it's true. They're going to learn, they'll be very resilient. They're going to learn to read. If they don't learn to read in school, they're going to learn to read in the home. Or they're going to get sent to Kumon. I mean, somehow those parents are going to get those kids reading. But what if you're a kid who's from a different kind of background? Are 80% of the low-income kids in Wisconsin going to learn to read regardless of what happens in the classroom? No, we know that's not true. Are they going to be at particular risk for reading failure? Yes. Are they all doomed to reading failure? No. But they are at higher risk, and they may require greater interventions. And the things that people like myself are trying to focus on are, the things that we could crucially do to make use of precious time before the kid gets to school and then once they're in school to kind of overcome some of these other kinds of differences in background. So I think what you're hearing today is there are people who think there's a lot more that we could do, but you're not getting buy-in from the people who are in the schools or their bosses, principals, superintendents, no offense. You're not getting buy-in. So you're not getting buy-in about, should we do screening? We already can identify kids who are dyslexic. Why should we do screening? We don't need someone telling us to be sure to include phonics. This obsession with phonics is making me crazy. Everything devolves into a discussion about phonics. Phonics is one element. Phonics. I could tell you about phonics. But what you're seeing is people who really are not buying in. They're not buying in on RTI. RTI is a logical program, makes perfect sense. It's all in the implementation. And the question is, who's implementing it? And how much do they know about reading? And how much do they buy into the reasons why they're doing these things? Same thing with the setting the bar higher for entry into the profession. Using the, what's Wisconsin's version of the MTEL called? FORT. FORT. People have to, it's not just that they need to know what's on the test, they need to know why they need to know this stuff. And that has not been part of their education. More likely they've been told it's irrelevant. More likely they've been told that dyslexia does not exist. More likely they've listened to Richard Allington, who's possibly one of the most famous people in the reading education world, who says dyslexia doesn't exist. He's never found a student who he couldn't teach to read. Dyslexia was invented by parents and teachers to excuse poor teaching. This has happened in England as well. People say it's a conspiracy to just cover up poor teaching. No, no. How much evidence do we need? There's behavioral evidence. There's brain evidence. The brain evidence is now being connected to characteristics of how brains develop and the specific things that happen that interfere with reading itself. And then to the genes that actually are controlling early brain development and how it occurs. The evidence for dyslexia, that there are these conditions that interfere with kids being able to read, is so overwhelming that to have someone say dyslexia was an excuse invented for poor teaching, to me is like by someone who's really a highly revered figure, and of course it gets repeated by the followers. If there was malpractice, this would be malpractice. Look, it exists. It's a biologically based condition. We don't know everything about it. We know quite a lot about it. We'll know more soon. And we certainly know that it's helpful to know that it is this kind of condition. It's helpful certainly to parents who then don't have to be told, did you read to your child? Were there books in the home? you know, or to the, it will act as a buffer against people who say, oh, well, your child isn't trying hard enough, or that, you know, you just need to work harder and do more of the same. More of the same is not working for these children. It's not working for these children for reasons we can now begin to specify at a neural level, though we knew it behaviorally on the basis of their behavior for a long time. So screening is important, but the question is, what are you going to do afterwards, and what kind of training do people have so that they can do something for the kid? There is research suggesting what will work, and there are what we think of as gold standard programs. If you're talking about little kids, one of these kind of gold standard programs, which does not just look at one element of reading, but looks at many of basic foundational skills that children need to have. You can help a very large percentage of kids who get really high quality interventions in the first couple of years. Reading recovery is a special case because it only deals with first graders, and it doesn't, the evidence about its effectiveness is highly mixed at best, and it has other issues. It is the case that interventions that are intensive and focused on components of, you know, kind of fundamentals of reading can be effective with most kids, but not all. And the research that I'm doing with other collaborators in various parts of the country is focusing now on kids who get really great, who are dyslexic, who meet the criteria for dyslexia, who have it in their families and so on, who are not responding to our best gold standard sort of intervention. And our sense about those kids is they have other issues as well. Their problems are not just reading. They may be, it co-occurs with hyperactivity. Quite frequently, it co-occurs with some kinds of speech-language problems frequently. Some of these kids who are the non-responders or poor responders may actually have multiple problems. And our task now is to try to identify these kids who have multiple problems so we can approach multiple problems. So look, dyslexia, we had some concerns about their lack of definition, clear definition. I don't think that's actually a problem. Those definitions are proposed for different purposes. So the pediatricians have a definition that's useful for pediatricians who need to be providing, making decisions about, for example, referring the kid for medication or for other kinds of interventions or services. And similarly, the DSM-5, the one that's done by the psychiatrists, their treatment of dyslexia is quite weird, and there is a huge amount of controversy about it. Some of the psychologists and people who study development and thinking and language like I do, who were on the panel, felt like the DSM-5 version of dyslexia was not what they wanted. It is a tool that's, I think, used mainly to sort people and for billing purposes and for insurance and for other things. It is not a scientific record. And indeed, you know, the former head of NIH, Thomas Insel, said we need to get rid of the DSM-5. We need to have a better way of categorizing people that's based on their actual behavior and brain. We don't have that quite yet. So the DSM is a tool, and yeah, it disagrees with other things. It's very confusing to read, and that's really too bad. These other definitions are introduced for various purposes. Scientists have their own definitions that take into account the fact that, look, it is on a continuum. So, you know, who's dyslexic and who's not? How are we going to draw the line? Well, some people are really unhappy about the fact that any place that you draw that line is going to be somewhat arbitrary. The reason is the behaviors of these children are on a continuum with people who are not dyslexic. There's no, you know, here are the good readers and bang, here are the poor readers. It's not like that. This is upsetting to some people because it means you have to set a criterion, and that criterion could be the lowest, 25%, 20%, 2 standard deviations from the mean, kids who are below grade level, kids who are below age level. Somebody's got to bite the bullet and make decisions about this because it influences who's going to get resources and so on. As researchers, we just look at the whole continuum. We don't have to do that. But for people who are directing people into programs and so on, you have to set cutoffs. Well, some people say, look, why don't you just get rid of the whole category? Readers are readers, some are better, some are worse. The thing is, it's like obesity. So obesity is a condition. It's not healthful. For people who are morbidly obese, of course, the usual kinds of help that they get from their family doctor isn't sufficient. And they might need additional intervention because their condition is so bad for them. Who's obese? There's no absolute cutoff between who's obese and who isn't. It's partly determined by social factors. It's partly determined by what the medical research says about how the health effects of being overweight and how you measure it. And you probably have noticed that the criteria for obesity have changed over the years. Same thing with hypertension. It's a continuum. Who's hypertense? Got to set some kind of reasonable criteria based on what we currently know. Those criteria also vary. They have changed. So there are people who are really very unhappy with the fact that we cannot say, is it 25% of the population or 18% of the population? Where exactly are you setting the cutoff? Why does this study put the cutoff someplace slightly different than something else? Same as obesity, same as hypertension. It's not like the mumps. The mumps, we could tell. Okay, it's a continuum. And the point is that there are kids at the low end of this distribution who really are, the consequences for not intervening and trying to bring them up to speed are severe. That's it. Now what are we going to do? What people say is, look, we'll use our best theories of how reading works, what we know about what normally happens, what typically happens, and what the bases of individual differences in reading skill are, and how much of them are due to the environment, and how much of them can be moved around by experience and doing various kinds of things. And then we will extend them to kids who are struggling. The problem is, that's how we do it on the science side. On the education side, people really don't buy in. So you heard a lot about the National Reading Panel report. There's 6 of those reports. There are reports in this country and other countries. They all converge on the same thing. They will dice up the pie slightly differently about what these basic skills are. But they all tell the same story. The story is about the kid already knows spoken language. 0 to 5, the child is learning how to talk. Now they're going to have to learn how to read. The problem arises when the kid is trying to figure out, how does print relate to what I already know about spoken language? Kid does not relearn English when they learn to read. All they're learning is how print relates to the language they already know. The phonics thing is just one element of that. What the research says is that when you become a skilled reader, you learn about print. That's the part that's really specific to reading, print. The rest of it is connecting it up with things you already know about language. And you've been talking since you were, learning to talk since you were born. Since before you were born, you're actually learning some things about the sounds of language in utero in the 3rd trimester. Children who are having problems with reading are not docking these 2 systems. They're having trouble learning about print. They're having trouble linking it to things they know from spoken language, about the meanings of words, about grammar, about sentences, about comprehension. You can see this behaviorally. You can see this in neuroimaging. The neuroimaging studies are beautiful. What they show is, as kids' reading skill increases, the areas of the brain that are active when you're listening compared to when you're reading overlap more and more. There isn't one part of your brain that's doing reading and another part that's doing speech. For all of you folks who are good readers, they come together. So when people are going on and on about phonics, what they're really going on about is one technique for trying to facilitate bringing those things together. In some of the talks today, I heard people talking about like a phonics-only approach, or phonics won't work for everyone. There is no phonics-only approach. It would be ludicrous. There are approaches that say, don't sound out words because that'll be the path to becoming a poor reader, something that has been contradicted by literally 40 years of research. So there are ones that say, you know, learn to read without emphasizing one of the things that's important. But this obsessive focus on phonics is really missing the point. The point is, get the kid to the point where they understand print and how it relates to language and move on. You can make things harder for kids if you don't emphasize that at the right time. You could also make things harder for kids if that's the only thing you emphasized or if you carried it on forever. Get in, get out. Do it effectively. Do it efficiently. Okay. A lot of the discussion here is about kids after they get to school and what should be happening. And that is really important. And it does, as some of the other speakers indicate, get caught up with other issues about curricula, about the companies that sell the tests and assessments and so on. And really, that does complicate things, and it's not something I want to address. What I want to address is, what do kids have to know in order to succeed? Does that differ for child by child? One thing that's sort of an article of faith on the education side is that every kid is different, by which they don't mean just that they kind of have slightly different interests or hair color or something like that. They mean they learn differently. This kid is this kind of learner, this kid is that kind of learner. The research really has not borne that out. It has been very, very difficult to establish that there are different learning styles. But it's sort of an article of faith among educators that, yep, you have to tailor what you do to the child because, you know, every kid is different and they have their different learning styles. That places a really unreasonable burden on the teacher. Teacher's got to kind of try to personalize the instruction for the kid or 30 kids. It's tough. And it's also built on something that doesn't really have support. I was saying that a lot of the discussion focuses on what should happen in school, and that is important. But what I wanted to emphasize for a moment was that what happens before the kid gets to school is really important. So this is really about as conclusive as research on human development gets. So children learn to speak a language, you know, assuming that under normal conditions, from birth to 5, 6, they learn really rapidly. They learn by using language and interacting with people. Then they get to school and they have to read. Reading is something that usually involves instruction and direction and feedback and so on. There's no culture in which kids learn to read first and then they learn to talk. So a kid learns to speak. The spoken language is kind of the foundation now that they're going to build reading and writing. Well, what we now know more than we did, or at least recognize and appreciate more than even a few years ago, is just how much children's early spoken language experiences vary. They vary because of situations and conditions in the home, who the adults are, how many adults there are, how many children there are. They are associated with socioeconomic status. They're associated with some cultural differences. They exist across various groups. The net effect is that children's early experience with language differs quite a lot. I'm sure you must have heard this by now because it's really entered the public consciousness. So there are children on the first day of kindergarten who are behind other children in terms of number of words they know and how much they know about each word and so on. There are spoken language differences. These spoken language differences are huge and have a huge impact on reading. So, the children's problems are originating before they even get to classrooms. In fact, there are developmental studies. I'll just take a moment to tell you about one that it was just really heroic. There's several of these, of course. There's one that was done by Dennis Malfasi, who was at Southern Illinois at the time. He looked at babies within 36 hours of birth. And the point of these studies, they're called prospective longitudinal studies of children at risk. So what you do is you find families where there's a history of learning reading problems, some family members. So those children are at risk. There's a thought that there's some genetic component to it, and they might inherit a condition that's going to make it harder for them to read. So you find the children who are in these families where there is a history of dyslexia, and then you compare them to children who are the same but don't have this history. So within 36 hours of birth, what do? You put these little caps on them. They're like bathing caps. They have little wires coming out of them. It's cute, but it measures small changes in electrical magnetic fields at the scalp. It's not harmful to the child. It's totally passive, and basically gives you brain waves. And what they find is in the children who are at risk for dyslexia, you see atypical brain responses to sounds. This is in kids who are 36 hours old. Did I say months before? 36 hours old. The point of his study, though, was he followed them for like 8 years. And he would test them every few years to see who was actually going to have difficulty with reading. And what he found was the kids who were at risk for reading and had these atypical neural responses to sound essentially at birth were indeed more likely to have struggle with reading. And the way in which their dyslexia emerged was fascinating. At first, it's showing up in their speech. Their babbling is different, then their acquisition of words is slower, and then their acquisition of pre-reading skills like learning their letters or learning the names of letters or just their ABCs is slower. And then as they get to school age, you find that they're not able to do things that we think are indicators, like they can't tell if words, they're not very good at telling if words rhyme or if words start with the same sounds or not. He also showed that the magnitude of how atypical their brainwaves were at 36 months were predictive of reading difficulties at age 8. It's astonishing. So there are other studies of this sort by other people. How Scarborough did the first of them. Snelling and Hume in England have done them. There are a series of studies now that show kind of the emergence of dyslexia. It's before the kid hits schools. It's in their speech. And then because of this, it migrates over into reading, because writing is just a way of representing spoken language. Now, if you put on top of that somebody who says, oh no, writing is independent of speech, you want to just look at words visually and figure out their meanings. Don't ever say the words, because that's the route to poor reading. That's backwards. It's backwards. Okay, so the origins are in speech. The problem is the kid is not going to be able to learn to link print and speech so they can get on to the important stuff, which is, comprehension, using texts for a variety of reasons, being able to write, and so on. That's why people like myself make a big deal about the kid needs to learn the link between print and sound. It's a pretty important thing. It's a hurdle. Most kids can get through it. You need some instruction. Some kids might need extra, and then you want to move on. The other thing is, if you wanted to help kids and to kind of do what I said before, which is to, prevent dyslexia before it emerges, the other thing you could do besides improving some of the practices in the school and doing the screening on the kids who are at risk is focus on their spoken language before they get to school. There are various communities that are trying to do this. It's a really tough thing to do. I mean, it's not tough in principle. In principle, it's, it's a pre-K or even earlier where the kid is exposed to a broader range of language than they're getting in the home. Some kids aren't getting exposed to the particular dialect that's used in the schools because there's different dialect is used in the home. Well, those kids could be exposed to more of the school language before they get there. There are various things about spoken language development, vocabulary. People talk about phonological awareness. All they're talking about is knowledge of spoken language and what the parts are. You can build that stuff. You can build that stuff before they get to school. You can build that stuff when the kid is young. Their braids are nice and plastic. They're very good at language learning. And then you will obviate some of these problems about getting into reading. And you will get them to the point where, it doesn't actually matter much what the teacher does as long as there's a certain amount of emphasis on reading. Okay, so one thing is we need to think about the precursors of this, and the precursors are all spoken language, and this is affecting a lot of kids. A second thing is we need to think about kids who are at risk of going off the rails. A screening procedure can do that, but it has to be coupled with people who know what to do with it. That's tough because it won't have been part of most teachers' training. What they will be relying on is their experience. And what I'm suggesting about their experience is that that's useful. But it's possible to overestimate what you can get from that. And indeed, there may be people who don't know what they don't know or what they're missing. And if you've got the wrong theory of how the kid learns and develops, then you're going to emphasize kind of the wrong stuff. Okay, a couple of more things. One thing is you have to do something, because the way that things are working right now, you're exacerbating achievement gaps. So the way things work now, schools are based on a pretty resolutely middle-class model, and they make assumptions. These curricula, these expensive curricula we buy, they make assumptions about what's going to be available in the home. It's pathetic to me sometimes. I've worked in very poor schools in Atlanta, Georgia. I have a collaboration with people in Mississippi where they are working with really desperately poor kids, and they've got brand new books. Somebody's invested in lots of technology and some support materials and so on. And the books are just assuming so much more than these kids have in terms of what kind of support they'll get in the home. You know, there's a bit of outsourcing going on where some things that used to be taught in the school now are being taught in the home. It's assumed that they'll pick it up in the home. And that kind of works if for middle-class parents, if there's, they speak the language and they have the time and are available and so on. You buy the software, or you get the apps, or you hire the reading specialist tutor, or you send your child to Kumon. You do these supplementary things if you have the resources, if you have access to them, if they even exist in your neighborhood, The system that's based on that kind of external support really is going to fail for a lot of children. It's going to fail for lower income kids. There may not be a parent in the home who speaks the language. They may not speak the language of the school. They may not use the dialect of the school. They may not themselves be literate or highly educated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They may not have access to libraries. The libraries may not have as many books, and so on. So it breaks my heart to see some of these programs where it's assumed that the homework assignment is going to be something, go to the internet and do this. It's not realistic. So if you don't do things to really concentrate on the kids who are most at risk, which includes the kids who have these conditions that interfere with learning, and the conditions whose environments interfere with learning, then what you're effectively doing is kind of part of the contributing to the achievement gaps. Because the people who have resources to go to the reading specialist or tutor or something will get the help the child needs, and the people who don't have those resources but can't get the help they need in the schools will not. Those folks in Wanakee are doing a great job. That was real. But they're, you know, I was looking it up a minute ago, their median income is, I can't show you this figure, but we've been talking about Wanakee, we have Oshkosh represented here, and we have Green Bay, and these are some data about sixth grade reading, and Wanakee, the kids on average are reading 2.1 grade levels above average. In Oshkosh, it's 0.6 grade levels above average, and in Green Bay, it's 0.1 grade levels above grade average. You know what? Those scores are perfectly correlated with the median income in those areas. It's highest in Wanakee, et cetera, et cetera. It's also correlated with diversity. Wanakee's 93% white, Oshkosh is 84% white, and Green Bay School District is 56% white. I only cite white to say, you know, the other groups vary in size. So, you know, there are schools where people are doing a great job. In part, you know, I've spoken with parents and teachers at a lot of schools. One thing that happens is parents' child, you know, report like the child is struggling with reading, and it doesn't look like they're being taught to read because they aren't, and they're just supposed to pick it up. And so the parent sends the kid out to some kind of, you know, tutoring learning center or something, and they get some intensive instruction, they catch up. And then at the end of the school year, you know, the teacher says, wow, Isabel really did great. She caught up. It was wonderful. She finally caught on. And the teacher's not aware that there is this, it's not because of what happened in the classroom, it's because somebody could afford the supplemental help. This is a very dangerous thing. It's just a way to multiply differences in opportunity, to have it built into your reading. Okay. Let me just try to say a couple things about what could be done. Knowing that it is a very complex, you know, education is like healthcare. It is a very big ship. There's a lot of stakeholders in there. We're not all looking at the same things. I think one thing that's really essential is we are not doing an adequate job preparing teachers for the job. That is not good for teachers, and it is not good for children. I have, in the book, I actually go through this history in some detail about how teachers are prepared for the job and why it is that ed schools, again, there are many in the country and they aren't always the same, but there's a general philosophy that you can't teach people how to teach, that it's something you have to do on the job. And for reading, that's really deadly, because most of what's going on in reading is like under the hood. You can't really see it. And so I think there's a general growing recognition that it's not to blame the teachers, it's to blame the people who are teaching the teachers. Give the people the tools to succeed. Putting people in a classroom and having to figure out what to do is a recipe for burnout. And indeed, you know that the burnout rates for elementary school teachers are high within the first 5 years of school, first 5 years of experience. So, you know, this is asking teachers to do unreasonable things. Also, asking them to tailor programs to individual children. That's placing the teacher in a losing situation. Or, having a child identified with a reading problem and then sending them back to the classroom to get more attention from the teacher. This is not making a reasonable demand upon the teacher. So teachers are not going in with the tools to do their jobs well. we could actually prepare them better for the job. Historically, though, there is kind of this separation between education. Educators really want to be left to do their thing. It's a very isolated kind of unit, not historically in this country. And it's kind of an ingrown culture. And there's a real resistance to getting into any of this other stuff that they don't actually know, but is relevant to how kids learn. So I really do think this is one of the challenges that we have locally and nationally. How can we train teachers better? Give them better preparation for the job so that they can do the job they want to do. I agree with the previous speaker. We also need to be talking to the principals. I've talked to teacher groups where they say, yeah, we go back with all this stuff, we're raring to go, and they're getting shut down from above because the principal can't see the payoff. How to teach teachers better is a real challenge, and I think requires a radical solution. One thing you could do is follow the Mississippi model. So, Mississippi was always the state everybody loved because they were at the bottom. But we're on crossing paths here, folks. So Mississippi's taken an action. Mississippi's done a couple of things. One thing is they passed a literacy promotion act. They did invest money. The governor, I don't think this is a secret, the governor has dyslexia, and there's dyslexia in the family. The Literacy-Based Promotion Act, what did it do? It infused money into certain things I'll talk about in a moment. The other thing is that they coupled with private philanthropy. So there was a Silicon Valley kind of guy who invested quite a lot of money back in Mississippi, and the main effect of that was to set up an institute which is not part of it doesn't answer to the traditional Department of Public Instruction, Barksdale Institute. So what do they do with this government philanthropy partnership? They have reading coaches in every school in the state. They have them going out to every county. Those reading teachers are getting, those reading coaches are getting monitored very closely by people who do have expertise. They spent money to have retraining for all the elementary school teachers. So now they all have to take part of one of these, a particular kind of teacher preparation program called LETTERS, to make sure they all have some basic knowledge, right? What I said before is you can't just mandate that people teach certain things or that they do certain things or that they pass certain tests. They have to know why they're doing it. They have to believe that it's important. Otherwise, they're just going to come to my graduate student for, the answers and pass the tests and forget it. Well, they're trying to get them up to speed on, why are you doing this? And what do you do? And monitoring the teachers, of course, as well as the children. It's not going to turn things around immediately. There are all sorts of pitfalls. I could mention one. You heard endlessly, ad nauseum, people hear about this National Reading Panel. National Reading Panel had these 5 components of reading. Well, first of all, I didn't recognize the characterization of it by the previous speaker. It was not a review of the best ways to teach children to read. It was a review of what we know about how children learn to read and what the components are. And what it did not say was how to teach it. And in fact, that was the big flaw in the program. It said what the components were, but it didn't say how much of this and how much of that. How do I know when to what it really, the place where it really ran into problems was when people tried to take it as kind of a guide was, they started to treat these things as independent. We need to have 10 minutes of phonics, we need to have 20 minutes of phonological awareness, we need to have some vocabulary, we need to have some fluency, and we need to have some comprehension. End of readings for today. That's not the point at all. These things are developing together and they feed each other. What you know about vocabulary helps you with phonological awareness. What you know about vocabulary and phonology helps you with fluency. These things are supposed to be working together. What I've seen, again, this was on a trip to a school, a pretty desperately poor school with a lot of very dedicated teachers. People chopping it up into little bits, which is not the point either. The point is the kid needs to learn about spoken language. They need to learn about print. They need to learn how they fit together and integrate those systems so that they can move on to that reading to learn phase you heard about. Okay. I have to say, I'll stop in the interests of exhaustion, not trying everyone's patience. Here's some things that I don't think will work. You can't just issue directives. You know, like, do people remember that No Child Left Behind mandated that every child fourth grader would read at grade level every child would read at grade level by age 14. That was what the law said. But, you know, how? I mean, just passing law doesn't make it happen. You can't do it without the teachers and principals on board, and I don't see it. So I wrote this book, it got a certain amount of readership, and you know, there are different tribes. And there are teachers who are totally on board and just all over me. Thank you, thank you. And there are other people who I know will not pick up the book because they already know that it's not relevant to them. It's another one of these people who's telling them what to do instead of letting teachers use their expertise. So you cannot, these things that would be helpful for dyslexics, for anybody who's a struggling reader, they're not going to succeed unless you get buy-in from these folks. And right now, you cannot guarantee that. You need a certain level of expertise. And here I have to say, this group has really great ambitions. But there's a problem we all know, which is that you can't just, it would be great if there were teachers who had better preparation and better skills. And we can try to make them pass tests and so on to ensure that they gain some of these skills. But you know, the history of trying to raise the bar on certification in this country is very consistent. It's happened over a 50, 60-year period. Every time a state tries to raise the bar on the qualifications to teach elementary school, when they succeed in implementing those things, they are accompanied shortly thereafter by the introduction of alternative pathways to certification. It's happened repeatedly. It happens for a number of reasons. One is you need a certain number of people to fill the classrooms. If you don't have enough people passing the tests, you got to hire people. The other thing is resistance to the being tested. The idea that there's something I don't know, I can figure this out, I know what's going on. I'm the person who's in the classroom, who knows more about reading than me? Well, you do know a lot about reading, and what your expertise is really essential. Now let's add this other stuff which is not obvious and was not part of your training. So you can try to raise the bar, but there's another part of the building where they're going to try to lower the bar, and that seems to me kind of a problem. What do you do about that? I just say it more neutrally. Teachers have to have incentives to learn these things. So there's a lot of resources out there. There are a lot of courses. I got a course. I mean, there's online materials, there's other ways to gain these skills, but not by telling people that they're defective, and not by, you know, teaching like it's something anybody can do and doesn't require any training, but by making it easy for people to gain these skills, and also giving some people some incentive for learning it, right? They have to have a reason to want to know this extra stuff. They have to be convinced it's going to help them. The last thing I'd just point to is, teaching is hard. It's a skill. It's a skilled profession. But a lot of the problems could be headed off if we did things with kids before they got to school. One of the problems with Teach for America is that teaching is hard, and so often the people are placed into settings where it's very difficult for them to succeed. It's hard. It's a hard job, and it's hard to succeed. Well, one thing that would be great would be having some bright, educated individuals who are working with kids before they get to school, where the issues of classroom management and grading and assessment and many other things are, the skill level is a bit lower because you can do language enrichment. Again, in a Mississippi school, I saw a Teach for America young person working with some pre-K kids. She's got a picture board and she's interacting with the kids in a very lively way. She's speaking in her normal manner. She's not talking down to them. And they were learning words like habitat. It was about animals and their habitats. It's great. It's great. And this teacher's very interactive and so on. She had no training, but she could really boost their language, increase their vocabulary, increase their knowledge of the world. It's hard to learn to read the word giraffe if you don't know what a giraffe is, because you never experienced a giraffe. So here's this person who's doing all this great stuff, vocabulary, spoken language, she's interacting with the kids, all sorts of great stuff is happening. We could do more of that. We could definitely do more of that. And it would be of particular importance from kids from lower income backgrounds who may not have the same range of experiences and may not have the same options elsewhere. The problem with that situation, though, was it was the school in which the pre-K was in the same building as the rest of the school. And we were touring all around and to the various classrooms. And we went from this pre-K where it was very interactive and the kids were being encouraged to talk. They were getting feedback. The instructor was modeling language and how to use it and all sorts of things. Then they moved on to a classroom where the teachers were not as well trained and where they, were kind of marching through the parts of the National Reading Panel. And the most heartbreaking thing was that it was a classroom where they were very focused on control, and so the children were not allowed to really talk unless they were asked things. You see this in a lot of schools, particularly in low-income areas where the teachers are really concerned about maintaining control and order. And the kids have very few opportunities to talk, to use language interactively. I've said to you, their reading problems, a lot of them are just secondary to their spoken language. And then they get to school, no talking. They were in pre-K in one room in the building, they're talking away. Then they go into the K, and it's control and sit in your seat, and you talk in groups when it's elicited. No, those kids need more spoken language. So that's the kind of thing where people with relatively basic training could actually do a great deal. There are other examples of this in other states, Minnesota Reading Corps and other things like that. You could put people into pre-K settings where the goal isn't so much to start teaching the child to read, it's to get their language up to speed so that they'll not be gobsmacked when they get into school. I think that would do as much as the things we're doing now. So, having said that, I should just say, for that book about the dyslexia controversy, one of those authors, Grigorenko, I've written 2 papers with, and I know quite well. And yeah, there's debates about dyslexia. They're at the level of which genes are actually going to be controlling, are they really just affecting reading development, or are they actually affecting parts of the brain that will also affect learning math and a lot of other stuff? They also take up this debate about where do you set the cutoff, and they're academics. They review the literature. They say, oh, everybody puts a cutoff in a different place. Well, yeah, blood pressure, obesity. Let's be reasonable. You have to do something. And so, these issues are not all settled, but it's known beyond any reasonable doubt that there are children who have conditions that definitely leave them at risk for learning difficulties, many of whom can be helped with interventions that focus on the right kinds of things. And others will continue to struggle. They are difficult cases. The state of the art in the research right now is trying to figure out what it is about those kids that makes them so much more difficult to reach.
Thank you for your testimony. I greatly appreciate it. I found it fascinating, and I could have sat here all night, but I think everyone else is wanting to probably move on. Are there any questions? Go ahead.
Dr. Seidenberg, you talked about the need for developing language at the preschool level. Would you consider or propose that maybe one of our interventions that we suggest legislatively is some sort of language program used in our 4K programs in our state?
I think that would be a fantastic way to spend that 4K. It might not be to the exclusion of everything else, but you can, so the answer is yes. But think of what that would involve. All you're really trying to do is make sure that that experience involves what? One thing that's useful is if there, languages, dialects vary, people's language backgrounds vary. Make sure that you've got more than one teacher in the classroom and that they're modeling. Some of them are speaking in a kind of a standard school way. Some of them are speaking in the way that's more relevant to their community. Show that these systems, people can communicate back and forth using these systems. But just model for the kids more of the language, what they sometimes call it academic language. It's just more of the language that is going to be used in school and that's going to be in the books that they're reading. That's not necessarily like a formal program. That's language exposure, language learning. Young children are really good at it, pour it in their brains. So to me, that would be a really great thing, not to the exclusion of screening and doing things once they're in school.
Mm-hmm. I actually served on the Read to Lead Council, and that was one of our goals, was to get more training for teachers and more language into the preschool programs. Of course, it never went anywhere, but that was one of our goals.
Yeah.
I have a second question for you. Are you aware that the Mississippi schools had an administrative component, administration training?
Yeah.
To their
Yes, they built quite listen, it'll be years before we know how well this has worked, but they're doing it at every level. They're teaching the principals, they're teaching the teachers, they have coaches who are in the schools who are working with the teachers, they learn to know their coach. Again, it's kind of this government philanthropy partnership, but I think it's pretty effective. I was trying to describe for you, you can also end up with people who are just kind of marching through what they've been taught. It's a little bit more, it's going to take more than that. But they're working on having teachers who know more about things they should definitely be emphasizing and not have to just discover them through 40 years of observation.
Sure, yeah.
And is it true that Mississippi used America Succeeds program for their business connection?
I'm not sure.
That's what I've been told. Okay, thank you.
They get their money from Barksdale.
And
They
Stephen,
got $100 million from Barksdale.
You had a
I mean, they
question.
raise other funds from other folks.
So I wanted to start by just telling you because I don't know if you know that in about 1986, two of Dennis Mulfesa's graduate students pulled me out of the hallway, pinned me to a chair, and taped electrodes to my head as part of showing the early feasibility of what he was doing before he turned to infants.
And Steve, did that help you read?
It may have.
Did it interfere with anything?
I don't think so. I want to clarify something. You spoke and as a psychologist, I know what you were talking about, that there is really no basis for the widespread belief and faith in learning styles. But I want to be clear. I want to give you a chance to be very clear about what you mean by that. That's not suggesting that everybody learns everything at the same pace, at the same rate, on the same day, but that sometimes what appears to be a difference in learning style is really a difference in pace. Everybody's learning the same thing in the same order. Some kids are just doing it so much faster.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and he stated it quite well. What people are seeing as learning styles, you know, teachers see the kids for a window of time. And you know, when you say, I never met somebody who I couldn't teach to read, you want to know what happened to that kid downstream. And there's not that much of that kind of follow through. But what we're talking about, our kids are not all learning on the same timetable. They've got different experiences, backgrounds, and so on. And so what's looking like individual differences in learning style is these kids are kind of off, maybe the same age, but they're offset in terms of where they are on kind of a developmental trajectory. There can be rare cases of kids who have some kind of perceptual hearing or vision problem, but that is a tiny, tiny percentage of kids, and they should be screened and dealt with by appropriately. Yeah.
Go ahead, Brenda Warren.
Following up on that, what you just said, and then again, I just want to clarify for myself, you talked about that, but then there's essential things that kids need to know in order to learn how to read.
Yeah.
And so a comment I hear a lot, and we've heard today, is that there's no one-size-fits-all reading instruction. But it's my understanding that there are certain skills that all children need to be able to learn how to read. Can you just comment a little bit about that based on the comments you just made about the learning styles?
Yeah, so here's the thing. Everybody needs to learn the same stuff. I mean, reading is essentially the same for everyone. It's the same skill. It's like everybody needs to ride a bike. I mean, there are certain skills you need to ride a bike. There are certain skills you need to be able to read. There's no way of reading without, like, syntax. There's no way to read where you leave one of the components out. There's a certain number of skills that come together that support reading. But so that doesn't change. That doesn't change if you're reading Chinese. It doesn't. We've done the studies. It doesn't change by language or writing system. The components of reading are the same. We know where the kid needs to get, and the moving parts that have to come together. Now, is there one method for getting there? No. Some kids are going to learn it at home because they sat with their grandmother who taught them. Some people are going to learn it in school because they got some kind of approach. There are certain bases, buttons you better touch and make sure that the child gets. We know that if the child's vocabulary and their knowledge of grammar is limited, it's going to hurt their reading. We know that if their knowledge of spoken language is weak, it's going to hurt their reading. We know some kids have more difficulty with print. That'll hurt their reading. But what they have to learn to be a skilled reader, it's not different. There are certain things that have to be moving. Yeah.
One more question.
Sure.
In our scope, it says, let's see, committee shall consider legislation to ensure that reading instruction and intervention practices incorporate relevant research findings from the University of Wisconsin. And I'm wondering, when I look at that, what's your reaction to that in terms of what it would be important for us to consider as we do our work?
My hearing is not so great. What was the first part? What do I think you should do?
It just says, the committee shall consider legislation and then I'm skipping some, but it says to ensure that reading instruction and intervention practices incorporate relevant research findings from the University of Wisconsin.
That was very specific. Look, I think research, let me, we're in a tough situation here, okay? There is research, and people should know about it. However, what you've heard in this replaying today, this afternoon, of the reading wars was people never agreed about what counted as evidence. And so when you say, and something like evidence-based, it's like natural food now. And the What Works Clearinghouse disaster, it was supposed to be the imprimatur for the programs that were good. It failed. It failed because there was a disagreement about what would count as evidence. They only included a certain narrow range of studies. And moreover, they didn't police whether the people doing the studies were arm's distance from the programs themselves. So one of the complaints about reading recovery is that the effectiveness of the program has been evaluated by people who are not arm's distance from the program, but in fact are the United States representatives of the program. So there's no agreement about what the evidence is, and that makes it hard to get people on board. You can pass a law which says it should be evidence-based, and you will have people say, my program is evidence-based. I did a one day of phonics. I literally had people say this, where you just have to check off the box. We've been doing studies of the curricula that are used in the schools. Now they just dump everything in so that they can say they've covered all of these bases. What happens in the classroom and how much they get used and all of that stuff, how are you going to, it's like, how are you going to police that? How are you going to, you don't want to police it. How are you going to know that that's going to happen? So would it help to like have things based up to date and based on a current understanding of kids and development and reading and so on? Sure, sure. But I think it goes back further. People coming into the field, people being trained, and in-service training. I think what you could do of that sort is you could do effective in-service training.
Well, thanks to everyone for your patience, and this is, yes, you may. This is the final one.
Absolutely. You have talked about time and pacing of learning. Our school schedules are typically 9 months, 180 days. Are you familiar with any research about the length of the school year and the timing of those days, specifically year-round school, and how that impacts learning to read?
I don't want to speak to the issue of should you be starting at 7 in the morning or 8, but the issue of what happened, the summer dip is real. And so you definitely do have kids who are, you know, maybe those kids who are at risk, who are coming from who have fewer resources in the community, who are kind of, everybody's working hard during the year, they've made a certain amount of progress, and there is really a dip over the summer. So in summer programs that kind of remind kids about things they've learned, to keep it there and not have it just fade away, that's important.
And then I had one additional one. We've heard a lot today about prior to school and early education. Do you have any recommendations or research about appropriate accommodation and intervention for middle school and high school students?
Well, I can definitely say that I was on a national panel that reviewed adult literacy instruction, which was meant adolescents up. That's really hard. It's just really hard. We don't want to think that reading instruction, people have talked about how reading instruction ends, you know, grade 3 or so, and then they have to move on. No, there's some kids who haven't got it yet and who will continue to need that support. And Yeah, so a little bit more emphasis on not just if you haven't learned to read by grade 4, then the parents got to take the kid elsewhere to get those skills. And so I guess the idea that you can be a struggling reader past, there's not a expiration date on that. It can continue. And so, again, schools can provide that kind of input if there are people who have the skills and if there's time during the day and there are resources, et cetera. I think the point that being a poor struggling reader doesn't, has to be over by the time you're, 10 or 9 or something is really, there are kids for whom that's not okay. So I think if you look closely at those kids, they continue to have issues with speech. Their vocabularies are small. Maybe there's no talking in the home, language in the home. I don't know. If you don't read, a lot of your language development after a certain point is coming from reading, so your spoken language falls further and further behind. Yes, continuing support for poor readers.
Do you support waiving foreign language requirements for struggling readers?
Well, it would make sense. I mean, one needs to have, I can't offer an expert opinion. I think the kids better be able to read well in one language, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your testimony. I appreciate that. Thanks to the audience members for your patience with going a little bit over. And I didn't see many people leave until just a couple of minutes ago. That says to me that there's still a big passion here. And I also want to just commend the committee members for sticking with it. Now, the assignment for the next couple of months until we have the next meeting is to be thinking actively about what we can do as legislation. We'd asked that question a number of times. I think we have some good ideas. If there's anything you need to follow up on with any of the presenters, certainly feel free to reach out to them. And if there's anything that you glean from that, certainly feel free to share it with the rest of us so that we can all, kind of keep up the work as time moves on. Is there anything I failed to mention, Legislative Council or Vice Chair Shatner? Excellent. Thank you. The meeting is adjourned.